So thank you for taking the survey. We'll move into that. Here are the responses that we were given, and almost everybody responded. So thank you so much. I know those can be kind of tedious, but hopefully we'll be able to cover all of these topics in today's lecture. And I think I'm turning it over to Reese at this point.
Yep, thank you. I'm going to jump in. Thank you, Kelly. And I'll go ahead and screen share. One of the things we wanted to talk about today, just to kind of set the stage for why we're doing this presentation and what we're hoping to just expand a little bit more on why we're doing the workshop, is that we want to take a deep dive into planting the willows with Jefferson, but we want to talk about the importance of vegetation when it comes to process-based or beaver-based restoration, and how vegetation success in abundance can enhance your project outcomes. So I'm just going to take like 15 minutes and kind of walk through the genesis of this topic and just identify there's sort of a gap, I think, in a lot of the information that we're getting about providing structure on a stream and about beaver restoration in general. So with the growing interest in getting beavers back on the land in the past 5 years or so, we've got a lot of great information about providing structure on a stream, but generally we assume that beavers will move in and take over without any real discussion of the beaver himself and what the beaver needs to be a successful participant in all of this. So here's a case in point. This is an illustration that's been around for years. It's quite effective, showing evolution of a damaged stream into a beaver managed floodplain. And I love this illustration. I've used it a lot myself, but after spending some time with it, I started realizing that it makes a really giant leap. And I've started calling it the magic chart, right? Jefferson, I think right around the same time you were starting to call it the magic chart as well. And like, we realized there was something missing. And it makes the same giant leap that I've been seeing in the beaver-related grants and project descriptions. And what's missing from this illustration is that forage, in other words, a basic beaver food source, isn't mentioned until the fourth panel after the beavers have arrived. And so the illustration really fails to recognize that beavers have to eat and that they can't eat BDAs. And so because we failed to consider beavers in all of this, I believe that at a very basic level, the stream restoration community is missing a well-defined notion of what beaver site success looks like and how we get there. Signs of beaver activity, it isn't enough. In my years of stream surveying around Eastern Oregon, I now look at sites, beaver sites, as either ephemeral or persistent. And ephemeral occupancy for a year or 2 or even 3 years is very different than persistent occupancy, where families are thriving with a sufficient amount of forage to maintain them in place indefinitely. A persistent occupancy site produces more beavers and expands overall distribution and beaver numbers in a system. And so in short, really the site on the left for me is a population sink, and the site on the right brings population gains. And so we'll look closer at these two examples in a bit. So what might the work look like to consider it through the eyes of a beaver and his view of the world and the needs that go beyond reduced stream power through structure? So looking at the beaver's most basic needs, every move that beaver makes is largely motivated by the need to stay alive, including safety from predators, and the need for a long-term persistent food source. So the translation for us when writing a grant application aligned with beaver's interests, it might use language something like this, or maybe something like this. So our goal isn't BDAs, and expect most folks would agree that our goal really is beavers. And so how do we start thinking about what the beavers actually need? The forage piece is really important on 2 different tracks. And this has kind of been a revolution for me, or an evolution. So like us and every other species, beavers have their favorite preferred foods. So for me, that would be an ice cream sundae rather than a can of spinach. Everywhere on Earth, poplars are pretty reliable favorite. So that would be aspen, willows, cottonwoods, maples. I think they'll eat from time to time too when they're available. And I often hear that beavers can live on suboptimal forage if needed. And so for me, that would be the canned spinach. And that's true. For a period of time, they can bridge nutritional needs with suboptimal, less preferred foods. Absolutely. But are they going to do it long term? And just like us, they're eventually going to take risks to find that enticing ice cream sundae after eating canned spinach for months and months. So the takeaway for me with this work and kind of my observations on the field has been that relying on suboptimal forage for long-term beaver success is not a winning beaver managed floodplain strategy. Second, and this is really important and might be a surprise, although some of you have probably seen this, is only a small portion of what a beaver harvests actually provides him nutritional value. So on land, harvesting and transporting trees back to safety of the stream side can be inefficient. And you can see that in this photo of an aspen hung up on the tree canopy. And I see this often, especially in denser areas. So not everything that a beaver harvests is actually making it back to their streamside feeding bench. And then second, only a third of what a beaver ingests actually is digested as nutrition. In us, we go to the grocery store, we get our groceries, we bring it back to our kitchen, and 90 to 95% of what we ingest, how's this go, is digested. So almost everything that we consume is actually providing nutritional value to us. In beavers, it's only a third. So my big takeaway from all of this in terms of trying to decide how much forage needs to be on the landscape and which sites are more likely to be ephemeral or persistent is that when it comes to forage, don't underestimate the amount of food a 30-pound critter actually needs to be successful when it comes to a high fiber, low nutrient food source. So when forage is lacking, how do these factors actually play out in the life of a beaver family on an Eastern Oregon stream? In this example, we'll look at the quantity of preferred forage at one of my study sites. The landowners are enrolled in CREP, and they've been faithfully planting willow for the past 15 years, but they hadn't been caging it. The willows numbered about 350 within a third of a mile territorial reach when a beaver pair arrived. The following years came den building, and family building, but in just a short amount of time. So here's our new family start a couple of years later. But in a short amount of time, they had actually depleted the nearby willow and started switching over to what they could find, which was juniper, sage, and currant. And those of us who have been on the land for a while have seen this. Juniper is often harvested, sometimes for food, sometimes for dental maintenance, if you will, and also building materials. But in this case, with these beavers, they had run out of willows pretty much entirely in their safety zone on the system. So after a 10-month diet of eating mostly canned spinach, because they'd kind of run out of all the good stuff, we noticed them starting to harvest a big, beautiful peach leaf willow on an old side channel that was about 220 feet off stream. And within months, one of the adults was predated by a mountain lion that was not far away from the willow. So the following spring after that, the family of 5 actually left the site and in high flows, and they haven't returned. There's just not enough food or motivation for them to come back to this site and settle in. So I consider this really an ephemeral beaver site. Eastern Oregon is full of them, and this site will likely never support beavers long term unless we can expand established vegetation quantities in this reach by the thousands, not just the hundreds. So what might this look like? What if beavers arrive day one to the size of larder that provides them with enough forage for food and construction needs, but also allows the willows to regenerate between harvests? In other words, we set up a rotational grazing system. So for practitioner planning, we'd use a biology forward approach that effectively swamps out a half-mile reach with preferred vegetation all at once and long-term site persistence as our destination. And by the way, BDAs might be very useful in here to help get the veg established. And then we cage it all too for allowing the veg to get fully mature and established and prevent heavy browse by beavers or ungulates passing through. So let's consider what might happen over time as beavers are central place foragers. If we think about their primary activities are going to happen mostly over at the primary den site and kind of the area that they've invested the most facility building in, their dam, their dens, that kind of thing. So they'll really start foraging in that area as they settle in. They're building those dams and dens. They might start having babies and expanding if they feel like there's a good enough food source. And over time, what they do is they start depleting that upstream forage. And so they'll start moving into this downstream area and build another den site and maybe some more dam sites to start accessing those other parts of their territorial reach where they can get safe forage proximate to stream side. And then eventually, when they run out of food upstream, they'll probably relocate the whole family downstream and all of their activities downstream and switch their primary dam activities over to this other site where they'll start all of their harvesting activities in earnest up there. But then at the same time, this gives that upstream area a rest. And so this is really sort of the kind of the vision that I have, and I think we're starting to think about is what is the amount of food that we need to establish in these systems for beavers that have this need to move throughout that system and not be disrupted by a lack of food or high flows. You know, we want to incent them to come back and do these dam repairs and stream or structure repairs when we get high flows that come in. So this just gives an example, kind of rinse and repeat of what this site might look like over time. This is a functioning beaver managed floodplain. It persists indefinitely and all function is returned in a state of dynamic equilibrium. So this is really my destination for a beaver managed floodplain. And so let's look at it just one more time because it was interesting to me to consider this as well. So if we were to look at both of these sites, first the ephemeral site with the dotted line is the total amount of food available on the stream reach within safety. What we just looked at was a small amount of willows that quickly got harvested and disappeared. And this red line here represents the cumulative amount of beaver forage. So the amount over the years that they're foraging from the site. And then we look at, kind of how that worked. And on arrival day one with 350 willows, there was just enough forage available to entice the beavers to settle in for a while. But by year 3 or 4, they ran out of food. They were predated and left and because they lacked really enough forage to keep them in place. And now with them gone, the few willows that were there are able to regrow and eventually attract new beavers and possibly even the same ones from before. But what happens this time around? It's just rinse and repeat. It's just this cycle that continues to repeat itself. And this cycle on this system is one that repeats itself at 5 different sites, including this one that I've been monitoring in the whole system. It just rinse and repeats itself. So the last site, Site X, I'll call it, is practitioner planned and biology forward. So by design, an average beaver family will never exhaust available forage at this site. They'll just do what they do naturally and indefinitely and under their own agency. So this really is my beaver managed floodplain destination. And this is how Ellen Wall looks at how much forage is actually needed. In her book, it's an excellent book on beaver-based restoration and beavers from a geomorphology and a hydrology standpoint. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. She's a researcher out of Colorado State. And she gets that, we need 10 acres. Well, what does that really translate to for stream restoration project? And there's a lot of kind of different information out there, but pretty consistently, in looking at 15 to 16 different reports, I keep coming back to this number when it was one of the original numbers long ago by Glenn Bratt with a study where he says that assuming that there's regrowth along the way to that really a family of beavers would need about 1,000 trees per year is kind of where I come out, 1,000 trees per year in order to occupy that site over the long term. And I'm thinking of like 8+ years. And there's a lot of other research. I think we provided it in the booklet about long-term site persistence, where beavers can stay in place for a long time. So I also looked to the guidance from ONDA, because I think Jefferson's been really the most forward in looking at this question of how much forage do we actually put on the site. And he calls for, and you'll see today, 1,800 stems, mature stems, established stems of suitable riparian plant species. So the bottom line for me isn't necessarily exactly a number always, but it's really about, we don't want hundreds of willows on the stream. We want more like thousands. And so that's how I'm looking at these projects. Andy Gallagher's here. I know, Andy, you've been doing this too on one of your sites, which I'm really excited about seeing kind of how that shapes up over time. But planning in the thousands is where, and the thousands per half-mile stretch, right? We're not talking about a 5-mile reach, but really compacting that in so they can have access to that within their territorial reach. So with the successful beaver managed floodplains as a building block, and I'm almost done here, but I want to get you thinking about how these floodplain superintendents, in other words, these thriving, expanding beaver family units, might naturally recolonize, like at a Huck 10 subbasin over time. So I'm going to play this little GIF to illustrate a build it and they will come scenario, considering how our restoration sites might be colonized over time as the juveniles disperse from the main stem and successful families, making their way upstream in search of my recently established vegetation expansive beaver managed floodplain goal, where the conditions are present for beaver success. And of course, my role in all of this as a practitioner is to ensure that there's a path for connectivity to the lands of plenty in terms of forage and possibly structure and new arrivals up for long-term success. And Andy, I'm going to take your question. Thank you.
I have, I just wonder about your opinion on the difference between like a clonal willow, like a coyote willow, versus our clump willows. And I mean, I heard you say stems per acre or something like that. And,
Yep.
And like, what's the conversion there? I mean, I guess I consider
Yeah.
one big clump willow to be a one willow, but is that multiple willows?
Yeah. So, and I think Jefferson will answer that too, hopefully. But so Andy, I'm sort of like over at Horse Heaven, we're looking at 12,000, not the 18,000, but we want to get 12,000 plants started, and those plants may have 10 to 20 stems on them. But when you see how much that they need in terms of just forage and harvest, I mean, they can harvest, and they won't harvest all of the willow at the same time. They'll harvest a portion of it and then let it recover in time. You know, they don't harvest it all at once. They'll kind of take a few and then go on to the next one. So I'll see them harvest like 5 sticks at a sitting on one willow. But I'm really looking at, when I say 12,000, I'm looking at established plants. That's kind of the translation. And that established plant may have 10 to 20 stems. And then going to your question about the clonal willows, which was a term that I just learned last week from Barbara, is generally that's a coyote willow or sandbar willow. And what I'm finding too, in terms of recommending willow preferences, is that they really want a wider stem size. So having, and the clonal willows are generally thinner is what I'm finding. And there's a lot of leakage. So I don't know that they're necessarily harvesting for taste or flavor all of the time. But a lot of times they're harvesting for, what do I know is going to be most efficient if I harvest it, that when I transport it back to the stream, I'll actually get it there 100%. And so the coyote willow for me, I see as kind of a suboptimal species. And in fact, if you really are paying attention, now, like I know my willows better, if you really look at where they're harvesting when you find a beaver rich site, you'll see that they're almost universally going after those more of those shrub willows, like the gyres, Pacific willows, peach leaf willows, where they can easily take those thicker branches back to the stream with more success. So that's kind of a little bit of a long answer. And then Jefferson raised his hand. So yeah, jump in, Jefferson, because you may have a better answer on that.
Oh, no, just there it's great. There's this range of stems, Andy, that are recommended, and it also depends on what part of the process you're looking at. So I tend to have a higher number because I'm really looking at the implementation end of things. So how many sticks do I need to, how many cuttings do I need to harvest and install plant? And that's why my number is like 18,000. And if you're thinking, well, you're going to lose some through mortality, and what I'll talk about is really to limit that mortality. But if you're planting at those densities with low mortality, then you're going to end up at that other end of the spectrum that Reese is talking about, a few thousand less of actual surviving plants that might have multiple stems on each individual plant. So higher numbers for implementation, slightly lower numbers for what's out there and surviving after things have been established, if that makes sense.
And I'll add to this, I have found a report recently, actually was provided to me, that measured aspen. It was really interesting. It was the conservation course, so what was out in the 50s, where they actually stripped all of the living portions, the cambium layer of the aspen. So what beavers are after when they fell a tree isn't necessarily the tree. They want all the stuff on the canopy on top. That's the sweet leaves and the stems and all that new growth is what they're after. And this report actually had conservation corps kids or adults tearing off or stripping off the edible portions. And so it will show at different ages of the aspen tree how much food, actually how much ingestible food is available from different sizes of different sizes of aspen for the beavers to actually consume, assuming they get that aspen back to the stream safety for eating. Jefferson, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, and just Reese's analysis looking at that kind of that lowering, squeezing funnel showing, okay, this is what beavers have available on the landscape, but this is actually the small percentage getting to their gut and being digested is really useful. But as practitioners, again, of trying to establish that top of the funnel that Reese shows, there's going to be mortality and all sorts of things that happen after you're planting. So you kind of have to picture that funnel going even higher and bigger above. And that's what we've really come to realize, is that whole funnel and funneling down really is why we need to talk about thousands and thousands of trees on the landscape, rather than just kind of lipstick on a pig, kind of just a couple here and there. We're talking acres.
So we're kind of planting for the waste part too, the inefficiency of transport back to the stream side, and then also what they're actually ingesting. And this really occurred to me with a cattle rancher who started doing the math of, well, if I need 2 to 3% of my cow's body weight, then I know I need to feed them X, and same for horses and most livestock probably. And it really occurred to me, I'm like, no, that's actually not true, because one, they're not as efficient as the cows are at what they're ingesting. And I don't know a lot about cows, and I know there's a lot going on there. But in terms of what they're actually getting nutritional value out of, we need to assume too that we need even more forage than you would think. It's not exactly a 1-for-1 relationship. So we need to think about planning for the waste as well as the actual nutritional content. So I'll go ahead and advance through here real quick. And then I just wanted to share one last slide, and then we're going to jump over the good stuff. So yeah, just thinking about if we see this as a pathway for scaling at a sub-basin, kind of a HUC 12 level, and building connectivity into our projects, kind of working from the downstream stem and then upstream, then I see that over time, we might be able to start thinking about building connectivity on our whole sub-basins for those of you who are responsible for watershed scale stream restoration, to really start thinking about how we're connecting the dots. And so one of the tools that is getting some traction, always has, but right now it's getting a lot of interest, is that Beaver Restoration Assessment tool out of Utah State, looking at the land, what the potential for carrying capacity could be in there. Crooked River Watershed Council is starting to move into that with the Bonneville Environmental Foundation. And Roger, if you're here, I think you guys have been using that as well, maybe with some success. But that feels like a tool. If we can really get it better and calibrate it and localize it for our ecoregions, it feels like it might have some potential to help prioritize what's the right geomorphology and hydrology. And then we would obviously want to go on-site veg. It's just too hard to assess from a satellite imagery, I think, or like a national data set. But if we go on site and can do an inventory of what's already there, because some of these sites already have veg, right? But then just determine how much supplemental veg do they need. So I'm going to pass it over to Jefferson. Please chime in with questions. And I just wanted to kind of set the stage there with some beaver fundamentals and the reason for doing this workshop. So Jefferson, I'm going to pass this over to you and stop sharing right now.
And unmute, that always helps. Great. Yeah, I'm already taking notes for next presentation of things that I want to talk about. But let's see. So really want to say thanks to Sun River Nature Center for hosting the 2 days of this workshop, both in person and virtually, and really to Reese for making it all happen. She's an unsung hero in Eastern Oregon beaver restoration, and really brings right people together, and is a continuing force for the good of beavers in Oregon, and is a great resource. And I really encourage you all to reach out to her. This part of it is I really want to take things to a practical implementation sort of level, the kind of things that don't show up in published papers, that sort of thing, the nitty-gritty details behind that. A lot of us start out as fish biologists or wildlife biologists. We're not necessarily botanists, or maybe even gardeners or successful gardeners. And here we are in charge of restoring landscapes, and I don't know how to do that. So there's a lot of sharing that we should be doing as a community amongst ourselves. A couple of caveats. One, I sometimes will just intermingle or interchange willow and cottonwoods and talk about cuttings or sticks, that sort of thing. For the most part, when I'm saying willows or cottonwoods or cutting or sticks, I kind of use those all together as the same thing, because in most cases, kind of they functionally end up being the same thing. But if it gets confusing, please ask, and I'll do my best to say what I mean. Just a reminder too, that aspens can't be planted from cuttings and are only available as potted plants. Another thing that happens sometimes is if we'll refer to caging, kind of synonymous with exclosures. And really, we don't recommend caging individual trees, because you're never going to get to the thousands and thousands of trees that we need caging individual trees. So more like exclosures like you see on your screen right now. I'm also going to focus a lot on the why of things, and not necessarily the what. This isn't creating like a cut and paste prescription for your creek. Every creek is unique. Every time I think I know what I'm doing, and I move to a new creek, I find out I need to learn the specifics about that creek. So I want to help you figure out a process for finding your solutions and planning things, not just an answer. You know, pity on my teenage daughter that when we do our math homework together, I'm always trying to talk about, well, you need to figure out how to solve the math homework problem, not just get an answer, because you're going to get a new different problem right next. So the other problem is if I'm describing a bunch of actions, or this is what I did on my creek, you should do this on your creek, is it gets to be kind of like this imitation without context. And you know, you hear the metaphor of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I feel like if you're just kind of blindly imitating actions other people have taken, then you're blindfolded with a hammer. And sometimes you might hit the nail correctly, and sometimes you might hit the picture window kind of thing. And so it's better to know the why than exactly the what. And an example of this is the lessons we have and haven't learned, unfortunately, from all the work that was done out on Bridge Creek. And I'll discuss some of that in a little bit. Other things are that just the notion that planting isn't just a single event. It's not something that you kind of just do offhand, it's done, and then you walk away from. There's what I'm going to be talking about is a lot of planning, the site selection, prepping, the actual implementing, and then shepherding afterwards. If you're not doing all this and you're just kind of putting plants in a riparian area, it's just throwing a dart at a dartboard. Some are going to live and some aren't, and you'll never know why, and you're just wasting a lot of time. So it's definitely a go slow to go fast kind of situation. Other idea before I even get started is that planting is not just an on-off switch. It's not you do planting or you don't do planting. You may do a lot of planting. You may only have to do a small amount of planting. You might only have to do a certain type of planting. And that situation over the course of the lifetime of a project of several years might change, and you have to adapt your planting plan to that. We have a project at Hay Creek at Cottonwood Canyon State Park where the beavers moved in and are surviving on their own successfully before we thought we were going to be done planting. So I stopped planting. I don't want to get in their way. And I also don't want to plant stuff that's just going to be underwater. So you have to be adaptable and realize that it's a gas pedal, not a on-off switch. And finally, I'm really focusing on what I feel are pretty simple techniques. This isn't big Tonka truck kind of stuff. There's a mechanical auger is the most fancy big tool that we use. So it's along the lines of process-based restoration kind of thing. That's great for volunteer help, that sort of thing. If you just have one person with an idea of what they're doing and a vision, that's great. Somewhere I did want to reiterate, though, before I get going further, that Reese is going to keep an eye on the chat board. And if you have a question, raise your hand. I get kind of in a nerd tunnel when I get on my presentations and don't see that stuff really well, but ask questions at really at any time. And Reese will chime in with them since she kind of knows where the presentation's going as appropriate. But I don't see that as interruptions or anything at all. I see it as helping focus, getting you the information that you really want to know. So don't be shy. And we've built in a lot of time for people to ask questions. So take advantage of that. So BeaverHOODs is a strategy that I developed through my work at Honda over the past several decades, starting with stuff out at Bridge Creek and observations there, and implementing my own projects, implementing projects with a lot of collaborators where we provided labor. And it really was a process of evolution, of figuring out what things worked and why, and trying not to repeat the same mistake more than a couple of times. And it involved a lot of experimentation. There's a lot of really thinking of, well, this is what they say to do, but I don't know if I believe them. And I try it out, and then sure enough, yep, that's true. Or, I wonder if anybody's tried it this way. Haven't seen that. You try that. Oh, actually, that works well. So I'm kind of laying the groundwork by making a lot of mistakes for you all ahead of time. And it makes me think of this cool high school counselor friend of mine who made all the mistakes in life, but also was like in a cool rock band, but had drug addiction problems and all these things. So he can speak intelligently about all the things that kids shouldn't do, and he was able to turn his life around. So that's kind of how I see the example of how we've figured out some things. So BeaverHOODs is a way that a conceptual model basically that we use for helping us look at the landscape. And I bring this up because there are no silver bullets. You need to look at the whole landscape and what's going on with the landscape through beaver's eyes. And even though we're really focused on vegetation today, vegetation really is just one part of a beaver-based restoration strategy. And so BeaverHOODs helps us prioritize and investigate and ask a series of questions. So if you are looking at a beaver habitat, a degraded beaver habitat in Eastern Oregon stream, you can think of it as a car with 4 flat tires. And those 4 flat tires correspond to these 4 different categories of things that might be wrong. And just like 4 flat tires, you can't just always fix one tire or think that one tire is more important than the other tire. All the tires need to be fixed. And so you need to assess those tires. Does this one need to be fixed at all? Does this one just need air in it? And get them all working. And the car really isn't functional. That beaver habitat isn't really functional until absolutely all those tires are fixed. But again, plants and vegetation is just one of those 4 tires. And so you're like, oh, well, there's 4 different things. Yeah, four topics, 4 different categories that we look at. So for hydrology, and I won't go super into this because BeaverHOODs is its own topic, and Reese knows well that I can go down a rabbit hole talking about this for a long time. But what we're looking at, just kind of a high level, just so you remember, and maybe are interested in looking at it further. In terms of hydrology, the water in the creek is what's going to keep your plants alive. So understanding that's going to be important, and having that be a good stable resource. But it also, in terms of beavers specifically, it's providing their escape cover so that they can hide away from. That also covers the door to their den sites. So if they're reproducing, they're safe there. But there can also be too much water or flashy water in systems that are really degraded, and the stream channel is really narrow, and that's going to blow out dams. Or maybe the water table is going to rise so much that bank dens in a shallow, low bank are going to get flooded out, and your kids will die because they can't escape. So those are things to consider if they're suboptimal. In a lot of cases that can be managed. The topography or morphology of the creek is going to be really important. Is there going to be room enough even on the floodplains to plant all the plants that we want to plant? What's the soil type when you go out and investigate it? And what's the shape of the banks? Are there going to be banks that are suitable for beavers to make dens in or not? And if there isn't, then they'll have to make lodges up on top of banks, and that's going to require even more vegetation of a large size. And then human culture is really important too. If you're working really, really hard to get habitat back for beavers and kind of lure them in, it's going to be all for naught if the humans on the landscape either have direct intolerance and want to kill them off, or feel the need to kill them off. If there's going to be conflicts with infrastructure, like with constructions on the floodplains, or if there's not enough room for beaver to work and flood around and all. So we have to think about the human aspect as well, and that includes land uses. And it's easy to pick on cattle grazing, but if you have a cow walking around in an area with bank dens, they're going to collapse those in. That's a real direct source of discouragement for a beaver. And then finally, we'll talk about vegetation, and that's really our topic for today. And you know, what type, the size that you're looking for, competition between plants or browsers for it, stage growth of opportunity, stages of growth and size, limiting factors for survival, what actually counts as beaver food, and do we need to plant it all, or how much? So in the BeaverHOODs model, when we're thinking about implementation and number of sticks, and you kind of got to this when you're asking your question, we're really looking at, if we're just starting from ground zero with no vegetation out there that's good for beavers, we're looking at trying to get at least 18,000 cuttings planted, or 18,000 potted plants planted. And that's to start with, because you gotta start with a big part of your funnel. You're gonna lose plants with mortality over time before you even get down to that part of the funnel that Reese showed, where you're gonna just lose through inefficiencies of harvest or eating. So we're looking at 18,000 cuttings or potted plants per half or 3/4 mile section of creek. And that half or 3/4 section mile of creek that represents kind of the typical boundary length on a creek. So everything that I'm about to talk about after this is concentrated into a reach that size. That means about 3 acres of planting. And that's still just the starting point for getting beavers started. That could, that's just to bump them over the threshold of an ephemeral site. And you can plant more than that. I welcome you to, but most of the places where I'm working, I'm starting to run out of ground for good planting, and I need the beavers to start doing a little bit of beaver work to improve conditions before I can figure out where I can get more in. 6 acres, for example, is fantastic. And then you start losing gains, kind of getting diminishing returns after that, up to 12 acres. So again, this is a process that's evolved over time and through a lot of mistakes. And I wish we as a community could talk a little bit more about our mistakes, because we don't have time or money to waste on repeating them. And so you'll see some examples of mistakes I've made and all, but and I even just made a big one last year where I thought I could cut corners, and it was a great reminder. Nope, you got to stick to the model, and things work great. Again, the goal, establish a BeaverHOOD, which is what we call an area where beavers basically have what they need of those 4 categories on a 1/2 to 3/4 mile long reach, where they can survive and thrive, not just cling to survival. And today, even though it's just one part of the 4 tires, we're really going to focus on the lack of vegetation that's preventing that long-term occupancy. And really, can't say this enough, but it really means thinking about beavers as their own being their own sentient creature with their own agency. They can make decisions. Their priorities are different than ours, and they may act kind of unpredictably and such. And we need to respect what they can do on the landscape. And it's not really fair. You're not going to be as successful if you can't get beyond viewing beavers as a tool or something that you can engineer at or tell what to do. They're going to do their thing, and if you plan accordingly, hopefully it's going to work out best for everybody. But really, that whole goal, we're not planting for shade, we're not planting for resisting erosion, any of these kinds of things. Our goal is to provide beavers with the conditions they need for really a persistent, thriving colony that is in charge and managing their landscape. All right, so that's all just prep stuff. I get to talk all day, so it takes a little bit. But one thing that I really want to convey is that if you are planting in a way that you're looking for high survival and high numbers of plants and really maximizing your planting area and success, is that it's not something that can be done last minute. Just a couple of things before I get into more specifics, and you'll see as the process goes on here, and there's kind of 6 steps, so you can kind of see where we are in the process here over the course of the day. But just for example, if you're going to order up potted plants from a native nursery, in most cases, they need a contract to grow plants a year in advance. So you need to know how many plants of what type and why and where they're going to go a year in advance, so you can ask for them. If you're just doing cuttings, you're not ordering potted plants. You know, of course, you want to harvest them when they're dormant. So there's as much energy stored in the stick battery as possible to start growing in the spring. But if you're harvesting them when they're dormant, then that's not when you're going to plant them necessarily, because the ground's probably frozen then, or if you're using volunteers and stuff, it's not the most pleasant, or the water is still really high and you can't just physically get around where you need to be for the planting. So if you're going to cut a bunch of sticks or even buy a bunch of cuttings, then you need to store them somewhere. So if you're going to store them somewhere, you need to think about where you can do that in a cool environment where they're not going to dry out. So luckily, we're able to cooperate with the Forest Service coolers and BLM staff and have a place to store things. But if you're planting vast amounts of trees, thousands of trees, 10,000, 18,000 cuttings, this is a huge area volume of sticks that you need to store. So you need to set up those things. Another thing is that if you're gathering cuttings yourself, if you're going to cut them when they're dormant, as you probably learned the other day through the Willow ID portion of the workshop, it sure is a lot easier to ID willows when they have leaves or reproductive parts or any of that. And so you need to go out beforehand when they have those and identify your source populations in large amounts, and GPS them or whatever. And so you can go back later when they're dormant and harvest them. So that takes, that's a whole season right there ahead of time. So you can't really figure out how many sticks you're going to need, how many potted plants you're going to need, what type, what length, any of that, until you've really gone through these steps. That I'm about to tell you. And I've collaborated on a lot of projects where, people are, well, we got to do planting on a river stretch, so we ordered a bunch of plants with complete disconnect of where they're going and why and what species, and is that plant form, potted plant, cutting, length of cutting, is that appropriate for the site where you're hoping to put them in? So when I'm thinking about a timeline of planning a project, ideally it's a 3-year process, and that may seem overwhelming or completely slow, or you might be thinking, oh my gosh, no, there's got to be some way to shorten this down, and there are, but when you shorten things down, they come with consequences. So if you are doing a project on a creek that's new to you, and the first time you see it is in the springtime, year one would kind of look like this, where you're getting your bearings and you're understanding what the creek is doing and flows and such in the spring. You're doing kind of Google Earth work in the summer to direct where you're going to do your investigations for planting. In fall, you can gear up for what would probably be your first implementation during year 2 based on what you found. You're going to be doing some soil moisture and site selection investigations out on the site itself. But that's going to be the time when you're going to decide if you need or don't need, or where you need beaver dam analogs to help your plantings. And so that kicks off a whole permitting process. And once you start changing things on a creek with BDAs, then you need to assess, after you've made those changes, did it work, and what changed or didn't change relative to what you're hoping would be. And so you have to wait a little time for that. So a lot of times, like I was saying, I just made a mistake last year before last, when I tried to skip one of these steps, and I kind of skipped the BDA step and reassessing, and I ended up with a lot of dead plants, and that happens. And so I go back to the drawing board and I try to be more disciplined, and the year after I did it all right, and we've got incredible success. Actually, the planting was the one in the background there when we started. So we'll review this year 3 kind of thing, but the individual steps later on as we get further along. Right now, it's just too much, too fast. But this is kind of the timeline I'm looking for. And depending on unique characteristics and what you find on your creek, you might be able to ramp it up, or you might be able to talk to your funders and be like, yep, oh, well, if you want to only fund this for 1 year, then we can do it this way, but we're going to have, these potential consequences. So later we can break it down by year 1, year 2, year 3 about really kind of what's going on there. Other thing to keep in mind is that in your pipeline of projects, you're probably going to be dovetailing these projects in with other projects, and that while you're doing investigations on one stream reach, you might be doing implementation on a project you started earlier. So there's always something to do, and it's always good to start early as opposed to later. So already vomited a lot of words. Any questions so far?
I think Andy's got a few. Andy, do you want to just jump in now? You had noted an interest on the Crooked River. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know both of you have done quite a bit of work in the Crooked River system, and I think probably our issues are similar to others in that, and I feel like I'm ahead of the jumping the gun a little bit because I'm talking, implementation and the kind of the challenges and pinch points that we see in implementation in the Crooked River. One of them is that an example is that our systems are generally incised. So if we talk about implementing large plantings, you can only go so far from the stream and still expect to have successful plantings. So getting that large acreage planted is very challenging. And then related to that, the flashy system, it's an incised system, so you tend to get big flows. And so protecting our plantings becomes very problematic, as we found this year when we wiped out about 1,300 cages in about 2 days. So I just kind of wondered if you had ideas, experience, ways that we can work through that. And if you want to come back to it later, totally understand.
No, this is great, and Annie, I appreciate you being a good example of asking questions, and I like it. I do want this to be more of a discussion. I'm more used to sitting around the campfire at night during an implementation project and answering questions, as opposed to I don't want this just to be a one-way vomit of information. So that's great, and yes, we will cover that, but I don't mind dipping into it right now a little bit. So it's more of a revisit later. When you're talking about incised streams, and there's like a 3-foot wide floodplain at the bottom of some ditch, like at Camp Creek or something like that, and you're like, how am I going to get 3 acres here? There's things that you can do depending on what scale you're looking at. So if the only scale you have to operate on is I have to work here at the bottom of this incised ditch, this is the only place in this whole watershed I'm allowed to work, then you make the best of it, and it's going to become a really iterative process. And so you may be able to plant enough to have beavers come in and want to build and be kind of ephemeral, and through that ephemeral cycle you might be able to widen that ditch out. They're going to constantly flood out their food sources and eat themselves out of house and home because there won't be enough. But you're kind of trying to build back those kind of an inset floodplain that then you'll have more room, and then you can build back up. We've worked in places, you'll hear me refer to Hay Creek at Cottonwood Canyon State Park, which didn't have very wide floodplains, but it did have really nice persistent water because it was basically spring fed. And the beavers there were some of the few beavers that knew how to eat cattails, the new shoots at the bottom of the leaves. And so they were able to persist with a really low acreage of woody vegetation, and they kind of skipped forward and built dams rim to rim on really incised creeks, a really incised creek, 30 foot deep incision. And so that's why we backed out there. So if you're forced to work in an area that's really small, and sometimes that's how it is, if you're NRCS CREP and you've just got one landowner and they've got a half mile of creek or something where you've got permission, it can be a slog unless the beavers really show up in force. But if you think back to Reese's diagram where she's showing a watershed and there are all sorts of different beavers on the landscape, it's not a uniform distribution of beavers on the landscape. There are some places where there are beaver and there are some places where there aren't. And that's because some places at different times are just intrinsically not good for beavers to try to make a home. So super high gradient areas, rocky canyons, super narrow incised streams, those aren't the places that I would prioritize for doing beaver restoration. What you want to look at are these pearls on a string that Ellen Wall refers to, where you're looking for where along this incised creek, is there anywhere that it just bumps out a little bit and we can get the acreage that we need. It may not be right where we are wanting restoration to happen, but that area will provide this base camp, this stronghold for beavers to establish themselves, and they will change the hydrology, both upstream and downstream, enough, if you can get them established there, that it might assist you in doing restoration in those more difficult areas. What also happens that we've seen is that if you get beavers established in one of those pearls on a string, is that if they're happy in an area and secure and they have kits and such that go off, they'll kind of send out these little sortie parties to fiddle around in those areas. And it's okay that they'll be ephemeral in those areas because they're not dying off. They can just come back next spring and restart. But over time, you can get improvements and aggradation of sediments and that sort of thing. So it's kind of like a landowner who was asking me, why are you planting plants over there? Why aren't you planting plants there? Uniformly along the creek. You plant plants where they're going to survive. They're not going to do any good if you plant them really convenient where they're not going to survive. You help beaver where they're going to survive, because that's step 1A, is having a long-term population, and then you can build from there. Hope that helps. Yeah, Reese, you've got a question.
I just want to expand on that a little bit. I think what we're finding too, and I'm still new to this with the tree planting and that kind of thing, so haven't hit a lot of those really, really high flows like a 10-year event, but I think the way that the enclosures, like doing this as a larger enclosure, the way those are built, we are finding that these high flow event of 50, 60 CFS that we hadn't planned on can often, those enclosures with this fencing, and if they're devised right, like getting the caging on is really important to not only keep the beavers off, but if the caging's done well, especially on the upstream side, I think the caging can almost deflect some of the debris and the water volume that's coming at these plants. And so a lot of our exclosures that we've seen on our potted and our cutting plants have actually protected them from the really high flows. Whereas with the smaller caging where they're just kind of one-off, that seems that it's a little bit more vulnerable. I set up on Deep Creek at the Forest Service, and there were just all these little cages everywhere. And obviously the flows are massive, but when they're high. But that's what we're experimenting with now, is how do we build those cages where they're reinforced on like the upstream side, or maybe even with a point in the middle so that they can deflect and kind of spread that water out, and then not putting the seams on the upstream side, putting those on the bottom so that if it does breach, it's less likely, because the brunt of the water force or the stream power is going to hit a reinforced upstream side of that caging. And I do think in many cases we were really kind of bummed. There was some caging repair that we had to do this May, but overall we realized the caging is actually protecting our plants from high flows. Now, Andy, the place that you're talking about, I think your flows were like 2,000 and 3,000, which is like whole next level. But a lot of these systems are never getting that high, especially on the tributaries. So I just wanted to add that thought. Thanks.
Yeah. So we did, I will acknowledge, we made a mistake in that we used individual cages on a lot of plants. And that definitely was not successful in that high flow event. But we found that where there were clusters of cages, oftentimes the downstream cages survived where the upstream cages took a beating. So it that lends some credence to what you're talking about, where maybe the edge of the enclosure might take a little bit of heat, but further in it's going to be less intact. So I think that makes perfect sense to me. That is very, very helpful. And then, so the only other question I had is, you know, in areas where we do these plantings, a lot of times it's just keeping the beavers in check while the plants establish. And I don't know, I struggle with the beavers in our system, and I'm sure they're the same everywhere else, but I realize that we have stable beaver colonies throughout the watershed that tend to be there every year, year after year after year, and then you see colonies pop up that I would assume are the ephemeral colonies, but then it's almost like I don't know if it's dispersal or some transient beavers that just, there seems to be a low level of beaver activity everywhere.
Yep.
And getting away from it is very difficult, and getting plants to establish, even in areas where there doesn't appear to be beavers, oftentimes troublesome.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Reese.
I was just going to add, yeah, I think you're right, Andy. They are everywhere, and so I'm just assuming that they're going to show up, and that's why the caging thing is important. You know, the other thing too, I don't like putting a lot of litter onto the landscape, and obviously the intention is that we'll go in and remove it and be maintaining it over time. But juniper is kind of working pretty well too. And then we're adjusting kind of our caging strategies, like putting less, you know, just in terms of being more efficient with our crews, is maybe less reinforcement on the away from the stream side of things. And then kind of like what Jefferson was talking about, finding those slower side channels that we know that there's going to be water in there. But I assume that they're always going to be beaver activity. Beavers will disperse. Generally, they like to disperse about I shouldn't say like to. They'll stay near their natal family as much as they can and find that wherever they can find optimal habitat is where they're going to go. But generally, they settle around 3 miles away from their natal family. So they're pretty close, that natal family. But they're also up in the Methow. They've got beavers that are moving 94 miles in a season to find optimal habitat that hasn't already been occupied. So I think that's what we're seeing a lot of, is these guys are just trying to find a place that actually makes sense for them to settle in long term.
Yep. Couple of things was making notes while we were talking and you were asking additional questions. And we'll talk about this again later, but it never hurts to state and then restate things. But we'll talk about using deeper plantings to be able to plant further off of a stream, away from the stream. And so if you're thinking of stream power and how it disperses with more area, if you do have that lateral flexibility on a stream, you know, if you can plant really deep, it opens up a whole new world. So that's one way to help avoid things. But again, I can't describe enough, you know, you can't look at these sites remotely. You have to get out and walk the creek and look at them at different times of the year, and understanding where those spring flows are happening and what it looks like. If it's a foot deep of water, but it's just barely moving, that's going to be perfectly fine for the fences that we're describing. If it's, you know, rolling through with trees and that sort of thing, then that's something entirely different, or 6 feet deep. But it becomes all a process of elimination. And sadly, we can't just plant anywhere. There are places that are going to work and places that aren't going to work. And so site selection and all that prep work is worth a lot of time and money. And in terms of kind of like dealing with the beavers while you're getting it ready for them, it always makes me think of trying to make chocolate chip cookies with a 6-year-old in the kitchen, where you're mixing up the batter and they're eating it faster than you can make the cookies. So you never end up with cookies because they ate it all first. And so you have to, it's really important to have a really good protection of your cookies, of your plants there, until they're ready for the beavers. And that is a specific part of the strategy. And one thing people say is, oh, well, there aren't any beavers here. We never see any beaver sign. You know, they're 5 miles away, but they're not here. Well, if there's no plants there and you're planting a ton of plants, as soon as you have plants, there will be beavers there, and they'll be drawn to it like a moth to a flame. So it's important to kind of plan ahead for those conditions. Let's see, and we got about 8 minutes, I think, before our first break.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
All right, so just kind of continuing on that, planning for 1 year in advance. Other things that just to kind of justify that long timeline is, you know, when you're thinking about when you're gonna and where you're gonna source your cuttings, you're talking about large volumes, and maybe you aren't accustomed to working with these large volumes, but you know, what are you going to get? Are you going to get cuttings? Are you going to get potted plants? And what size? And so kind of pros and cons of potted plants. They're really great for providing diversity, because there's just a few species that can be planted from cuttings, but potted plants, you get a lot of different species. You also are getting something that already has a year of growth. And so you're already ahead there on your volume. They also come, if you're getting it from a nursery, they come in a pot with some nicely amended soil. And so that's a nice benefit. The diversity aspect of it, sometimes your project might involve goals that are beyond just beaver-based kind of goals, like you want better bird habitat, that sort of thing. BeaverHOODs is really focused on looking at a triage kind of thing, that first we need to get the beavers in there, and then we can make it better for other things. But until the beavers are in there managing the habitat and taking this ephemeral stream and making it a perennial stream, that it's kind of pointless to try some of these other things. So I really am focusing mainly on the beaver food aspect of things. Cons, yeah.
Oh, can I just add to on the
Yep.
potted plants, Jefferson? Because the way I've been thinking about this is what we're doing with cuttings is effectively cloning them, right? And so if we have, you know, we've been out to some of these sites where the willows are all getting knocked out because they have some kind of maybe a weakness. I don't know if it's like just they're not healthy from being at that site. But my thought too is the diversity of what that you get from cross-pollination, right?
Yeah.
Of the species. So that's why I think of diversity as even within, if you know you want a certain kind of willow, but getting it from 2 different parents, I think is important, so that we're not just throwing a bunch of clones out into the landscape that may have more or less vulnerability. So the potted plants help us to enhance that too, so they're less susceptible to getting all knocked out.
Yeah, good point. Not just species diversity for other objectives, but diversities within that same species for resilience. Yes, 100%. And also in terms of that stress on those plants, you are putting these plants into often like the worst conditions you could imagine. And so they are going to be stressed, and so they're going to be more vulnerable than in their little nursery settings or where you've harvested them before. So cons, you know, potted plants are really expensive. So if you're doing 18,000 times $4 to $8 per pot, that's a lot of money, whereas cuttings can be a lot less expensive. Potted plants, typically, I use the 14-inch tall potted plants, and a lot, unless you're planting potted cottonwoods or willows, if you're planting aspens, they can't be planted deeper than the depth of that pot. A lot of plants don't like to be buried deep. And so your depth to the water table to good soil moisture is really limited, and your ability to sustain fluctuations and have that plant survive is really limited. So you need to put them in really carefully gentle areas, basically. Planting potted plants also can be more difficult in that you actually have to dig a hole, not just auger or bang a stick in. We've actually, I don't have firm data on this, but I believe that augering holes, just a narrow hole for a potted plant, 14-inch pot, something that would just fit in. Augers really compress the dirt against the sides in some cases, and that sometimes those plants almost seem like they're root bound at first, just because if it's in a clayey area, they can't get out of there. Wouldn't be a big deal if you had different particle sizes and stuff. But the other thing is that, cons, you have to think way in advance of what you're going to have and where and why to order them. And then if you are getting cuttings, you've got to think, well, am I going to order cuttings or am I going to harvest them myself? And if you're ordering cuttings, are you going to be able to really dictate the species that you're gonna get, or is it going to be all coyote willow with not that diversity that you're hoping for? And if you're ordering them, again, you're going to have to think about that storage aspect. When are they going to get them? Are they going to harvest them when they're dormant, or are they going to harvest them a couple of days before your project and show up and they're already, we're trying to leaf out and such? If you are wild harvesting willows, if you're not collaborating with a nursery like the Forest Service or BLM nurseries, and you're just trying to get them from a creek, it can be really, really time consuming because you're having to wade through brush and stuff. And so you're getting maybe 100 cuttings per individual over the course of the day. And they might be all wonky if you're planting sticks with a hand pike and trying to fit it into a small hole and you're not getting straight sticks. That's going to be hard to fit into a hole. Wonky, wiggly sticks also take up a lot more volume for storage and transportation. You wouldn't think that would be a big deal, but when you're talking about thousands and thousands of sticks, it can turn one pickup truck load into a pickup truck and a trailer. And so that's a big deal. And you'll have to go find and identify them and then know where you're going back. Other thing is that if you're harvesting willows, there's 10:30 reminder. So maybe we'll finish this little section and then take a break. The other thing is that if you're harvesting, you don't want to kill off the clone that you're harvesting. So if you're taking just a third of any plant, you've got any individual plant, then you need a huge volume of plants to harvest from. And if you're wild harvesting, a lot of that volume that you're kind of looking out at the landscape and being like, oh, there's a ton of willows there. A lot of it's like dead stuff and not fabulous stuff to harvest. So other things to look out for, just these scaly bugs and some rust. We often have that we're bringing in from nurseries. So let's just take questions and then maybe take a break. Does that work? Bosses?
Yeah. I'm going to jump in here too. I did put a question in the chat to see if folks have like creative ideas of where they're getting cuttings from.
Yes. Thank you.
I know we've been lucky enough to use Klarno for some cuttings. I've got a few private places that have those young cuttings, but there's some, because beavers have been relatively absent from the landscape, we don't have a lot of fresh, vigorous young plants to get healthy cuttings from, kind of like what you were saying. I think Pine Creek with Kevin Pullen, they've got some fresh stuff that BeaverWorks was able to harvest from last year. But just curious if folks have places that they know that they're going to for cuttings. And I have been approaching the BLM about maybe getting cuttings off BLM lands insofar as that they actually exist, which isn't always the case, and kind of got 3 different permits that we need to talk about, including Army Corps of Engineer. So I haven't made a lot of progress with that because that seemed a little ludicrous to start with, but just was curious where folks are getting their cuttings from now and if it's working for them. And if you find that that might be a need that you have more of in the future, because I know it's a conversation that Jefferson and I and Chris Gannon at Watershed Council have been talking about quite a bit, is how do we actually create more nurseries where we can have more control over these cuttings and their health and ability to bring contractors and volunteers in to harvest.
Yep.
Anyone?
Maybe why people are thinking, even if you think you have a nursery in mind, and you haven't worked with them for a while, or you're like, well, I know our watershed has gotten plants from the Forest Service nursery before, we'll just do that. You have to start those relationships ahead of time, and talk with them, because they're going to start planning and divvying up those resources kind of the fall beforehand. And so you're going to have to know what your numbers are and what you want, so they can share those resources. The other thing is, if anybody's interested in helping start a nursery, it takes like 3 to 5 years before those plants are ready to harvest off of, or else you're just going to kill them, and you don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. So it's not something that ramps up really quickly. So if you're finding yourself with low resources in that 3-year timeline of things, and you don't know where these plants are going to come from, start right then. That's a great time to start thinking about where you're going to have. So a nursery you collaborate with, maybe they can start a stool bed for cuttings or something, and it'll be ready by the time you need it.
Should we take a 5-minute break?
Yeah, so 10:40.
Yeah, I think a 5-minute break is great. And I just wanted to throw out there that Sun River Nature Center Observatory has a nursery that we're looking to expand to supply riparian plants. So if the group as a whole is definitely seeing that as a need, we can communicate that and try to push that forward.
Boom, you heard it here. Kelly is volunteering land and irrigation for nursery. There we go. Great, problem solved.
Okay, we'll see you at 10:40.
All right, thanks. Great. We'll get started here in a couple of seconds.
Jefferson, have you been to Clarno this year yet to see how the cutting beds are doing?
Just from a distance. I haven't gone into the nursery, so drove by and looked through the fence real quick. But
Cool.
yeah, you?
Not this year. Mm-mm.
Yeah.
Oh, we went early in February, but things hadn't not well, we've got growth.
Yeah. I'll be out in August, so I'll take time to check it out there. Probably need to go jump in the river right there.
I know.
In August. Okay, well, just while people are coming back, one thing I did want to remember to say relative to harvesting is that this is a great way to tap into volunteer labor, and that harvesting cuttings is super labor intensive, and it just is, there's no quick way to do it. You can't just go in with a giant scythe and cut them all down. You have to trim all the little side branches and all of that. And volunteers love to do this kind of work. And so if you are going to use volunteers in this, and you're not necessarily a volunteer organization or don't have a lot of experience managing volunteers, don't try to do it yourself. Tap into some other organization. Oregon Hunters Association, on the Western Beavers collaborates with volunteers, anything like that, where they have the volunteer coordination experience, and you're not having to answer all these emails from volunteers, and say, hey, I need this many people to show up at this place at this time, and I'll bring all the tools and everything, and I'll have it all thought out. But you bring the folks, and I'll provide the work. And that is huge. Don't waste Forest Service staff going out for an entire day just to gather a couple of cuttings. That's a waste of high GS levels. Tap into volunteers. There are a lot of people desperate to help. So
yeah, I would say Oregon Hunters Association, I've been impressed with how big a group of people that they can rally, and they bring their own equipment a lot of times, which is also really exciting. So if you don't have your own supply of loppers and bags and and trailers and that sort of thing, a lot of times when I'm interacting with them, they're like, well, what equipment? Oh, chainsaw. Okay, I got it. Like, they just are super easy, and they're really, really hardworking. So that's another great source.
Yep.
Ashley, I think you're exploring maybe Ducks Unlimited and then Trout Unlimited. We were out with them last month, and they were saying this was one of the big poobahs. He was on the ODFW Fish Passage Commission, and he said, I would love to get my Trout Unlimited volunteers out, because he's familiar with Ben. He said they'd love to come work on these projects. So yeah, those are great sources.
Yeah, different people that Trout Unlimited, for example, they are implementing a bunch of projects, I know, in Washington with volunteers and such. And so there might be different people in different offices of your organizations that might have ideas. But yeah, definitely after this workshop is done, we're not just shutting the shutters up and going home. Email Reese and I with any sort of questions on any of this. A lot of times it takes a while to percolate things through for those questions to develop. All right, and our next break is at noon for lunch. Is that what it is?
Noon, 12:15, something like that. We'll do
12:15.
15-minute break, wherever a good breaking point makes sense. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll be on kind of step 2 of 6, and we'll shoot to get about halfway through by lunchtime. So, Andy, this is to your point, and I mentioned that planting is kind of a process of elimination. And this gets into that kind of aspect of things. You can't just plant everywhere. You can't just carpet bomb a landscape with plantings. They're going to work some places and some aren't. So step 2 is gets really into that aspect of it. So we're going to start by eliminating things. So this Goldilocks zone is an area. This is a side view of a typical creek, and it's trying to demonstrate areas where you should just, for the most part, unless extenuating circumstances, just completely ignore, and gives you areas to start focusing on the landscape. So at the lower end of this, at the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a do not enter there. That's the in between the Thalweg, the bottom of the creek, and about 2.5 feet above Thalweg. And it's not worthwhile planting there in most cases for lots of different reasons. One, that's right in an area where it's going to be extreme flood power and that sort of thing. But the main reason is if you're trying to attract beavers and they are coming in and want to feel safe, one of the very first things they're going to do is, if the water isn't about 2.5 feet deep, they're going to make it 2.5 feet deep, or try to, by building dams and holding back water. So you are just planting stuff immediately where it's going to be inundated for potentially permanently if the beavers stick around. And so that's just kind of a waste of time. The other thing too is when you're building your cages, and if you're putting them right on the edge of the creek, it's hard to get a good seal with the edge of the creek, and it's so bumpy, and sometimes there's indents and stuff that it's hard to fence the beavers out if you're right there on the edge, especially of a cut bank or an undercut bank or an eroded bank. And so you want to be back. So 2.5 feet above Thalweg. If the stream's already that deep, maybe they won't make it any deeper. But a lot of streams that we work on are just a trickle in summertime, and you need to take that into account. The other do not enter sign there is above 5 feet above the lowest low flow water surface area. And so you can kind of see that blue line extending off across the bottom of the zone. And what this is getting at is that, again, except for some extenuating circumstances, which I can talk about later, but in general, the methods that I'm describing using for planting and all, you're not going to be able to plant down deep enough to get down to suitable soil moisture levels if you're planting so high above the creek. Now you can do things like build BDAs to try to increase that water table level and bring it up and shorten that distance, but still that 5 foot distance has turned out to be a really good rule of thumb, that even with BDAs and planting deep down, the meeting in the middle of those two of water and plants, I really haven't had success beyond that 5 foot level. And if you start going on Google Earth and just drawing little lines on that 5 foot contour interval above the bottom of your creek, your low flows, you start to see that's actually where a lot of the vegetation separates out, and you're getting less riparian looking vegetation or kind of mesic dependent vegetation and more upland vegetation. And a lot of times you can just see that line on the landscape based on the vegetation itself. So there's something to that. So within those two zones, that 2.5 feet above Thalweg and no higher than 5 feet above that lowest water flow. And again, that lowest water flow, I didn't mention this, but it's not the highest flow. It's the worst time of the year. we're concerned about soil moisture during that worst time of the year. Whenever there's the least amount of water, that's where we're looking at where is there suitable water on the landscape, because plants need water all year round, and it's no good if they have it 11 months out of the year. They'll die if they're completely high and dry those other times of the year, especially if they're new stressed out potted plants or something like that. So so you're looking at it, where's the worst case scenario. But in that Goldilocks zone, that's our first cut as to where we're going to look for good planting sites. The other aspect of that is you want to be looking within 100 feet away of the creek, and that's based on beaver biology. So the farther away from the creek you get, the more vulnerable these beaver are going to feel and be to predation risk. And Reese has got this great figure here showing the hair coming up on the back of the beavers' necks there as they get farther and farther away from the creek. And Reese a lot of time talks about just 75 feet away from a creek. But you don't want to be, it could be tempting to plant stuff further away than that. But you're kind of luring them to their death, and that's not going to be good for anybody. Having said that, if there are opportunities after you've planted or in addition to planting or along the creek within that 100-foot zone on either side that you can plant at, there's some sort of spring coming in or persistent wet areas, that's great. Yes, plant additional there, because that gives topographical variability if the beavers are changing water flows or that they flood out, or if later, once they're established, they can build canals over to it, or it'll encourage them to build up dams higher if you're trying to fill in an incised creek. Those are all good things, but I'd actually keep those far off places caged, especially if there's something super yummy like aspen that they'll travel long distances for and risk their lives for. That I would keep those fenced off until the beavers are well established and happy there and have their feet under them and can make adjustments to the morphology of the creek in order to get to those places safely. So don't feel like you're restricted. It's just that farther away than that is definitely not priority kind of thing. And then here's an example of an exclosure that was put in an area with a little bit too much stream power. And there's all sorts of things to be learned from this. One, here it was really close to the creek. The creek hasn't even finished going down yet. But you can see that it's associated with a BDA upstream. You can see some of the wooden posts. Can you see my cursor when I'm moving it around? Yeah. Okay. And so that kind of actually deflected some of that stream power right at that exclosure. And so you can see the post that fell over and got squished were the ones kind of off deflected that way. Also that this exclosure is really close to the edge. And so it might have also been in a situation where it might be hard to make that seal along the stream edge, especially if there's water there. Beavers seem to be attracted to, it's easier to move the soil around, I think, and they are able to dig through and around and up. But in a situation like this, I would think about maybe using a deeper planting technique, so you can pull back if this is really a place that's a priority place to plant, that you can plant deeper but farther away from the creek if there's room. Other things that I would do are, again, is to look in the springtime to see what that water is doing around that BDA once it's installed, and get an idea where the flows are, because just moving things a foot can mean a huge difference in stream power. So things, it's like an exponential decrease in stream power as your volume increases. I can't remember exactly the math of it, but it's not linear. It's a big deal as you get onto the floodplain. So you can have water inundating your site, inundating your fences. That's okay, just not super powerful. The other thing is that you can see that, yes, things got knocked over and everything, but these fences are really easy just to kind of lean back up in some cases and repair quickly, and you don't need to rebuild them. So if you're trying to build something that's like, this will withstand the flood, a lot of times that's going to be so expensive to build that then you're not doing a lot of other things like planting, putting resources into other things, and to repair them, it's just going to be expensive as well. Floods will take out fences. It will happen. And spring is always a nervous time, but we can mitigate that a little bit. What you got, Bruce?
Oh, I just want to add to this because this was my mistake. And we learned from this. So this is, we probably should have reinforced a little bit more in the front end. But I think the biggest mistake here, and I do feel like this enclosure really protected some of these plants. But one of the biggest mistakes we made is the seam into the enclosure is on the stream side. And so when we had this failure, the beavers actually got into this enclosure and they ate before we could go and repair it. And they ate all of our aspen, which was great. And then they just left all their little sticks outside of the enclosure right next to it, just to add insult to injury. So this is, again, I maybe we just have a class on how to build great enclosures and just do some exploration and brainstorming with people on how to get better and better at this. But this was one of those learnings, like our seams now are always on the downstream inside of the enclosure. We are reinforcing the front ends with deeper T-posts and more T-posts. Instead of making a rectangle like we've done in the past, we're making these pointy. And then we're also looking at where that stream power is coming, because sometimes, in our early enclosures, it's getting hit from the side. If we've got a loop or something, forgot the name for it. But yeah, it will hit it on the side. So playing with these enclosures is, I think, going to help protect our plants in the long run. And yeah, we just popped these back up and put some more T-posts in and reinforced our failure points. Ashley, I think you helped us with this enclosure, or the one upstream from this. But that we didn't find that sweet spot like Jefferson was talking about. And then the other thing I want to add too, and Jefferson, Brad has a question in the in the chat, maybe you could speak to. But I want to add that we did invest in a drone last year, and that's been a big tool for me to be able to see outside of augering and doing test pits, identifying where the low points are in your floodplain and where the water kind of naturally wants to flow. In this case, we did not wait a year to do our planning. We did it shortly after the BDAs went in. So again, we took some shortcuts here and had some loss as a result of that. But the drones can be really helpful to just to see where the water naturally is going on its own, especially at high flows.
Yeah. What's the question in the
Yeah, so Brad's asking about upland species and school willows. And then, so he's got some upland sites that are close to the stream bank. And just wondering your thoughts on that.
So about, that's about how to enclose upland sites, or
No, about planting upland species.
Oh, planting upland species.
I think beavers would use the schooler willow, Brad, for sure. The question is there predation risk if
Oh.
you're planting it too far away from the safety of escape cover that the stream provides? That would be the concern there, depending how
Yeah.
far away you get from the stream.
And I would assume, you know, these animals are starving, and there's a lot of the landscapes that we're working with, everything is starving. And if you're going out and you're looking in your watershed and you're finding the only golden currant is growing well under juniper trees that have fallen over, where the deer can't get at them, then you're looking at a landscape that's going to be really averse to getting large large bodied plants going. So if beaver are starving, they can wander beyond that 100 feet to go get things. Just in my neighborhood alone, along the Deschutes, they were climbing up over cliffs and going 200 feet away to eat aspen in neighborhood yards. So you're putting a lot of time and effort into any sort of plantings, and there's so many things that can kill them, that just from dehydration or pests or browse, building a fence is not that expensive. You might as well do it. And I've actually had people say, well, can we build a fence on 3 sides, the river side, and not on the upstream side? And no, you need a real you need the fence all the way around on things. Another thing that your drone comment reminded me about, Reese, is that I've really started to use trail cameras a lot to monitor water flows. And Reese has turned me on to these super cheapy ones that are $60 or something like that. And so you can get a bunch. And if they're taking photos on a time lapse a couple of times a day, then it's as though you were out there every day looking at the creek. And it's a really nice opportunity to look at general kind of landscape flows, but you can even measure water height, not CFS, but water height by what I'll do is I'll put a T-post in the creek and then have a trail camera just focusing on that T-post. And so I can just see what with the time-lapse photos and see how the flows change throughout the year. And this is a great thing to do right away when you think you're going to be working on a creek. If it's a creek that is from snowmelt, or it's going to have different hydrological regimes than if it's one that has irrigation taken out of it. Or if it's a spring-fed creek, we'll have spring-fed creeks that actually have their highest flows in late summer, where everywhere else that's low flow, and August and September. But it takes that long to get the water to filter through from the previous season. So understanding what your regimes are, and just I think I have this in my notes a lot. Just don't make assumptions. Really try to figure it out and be on the landscape as much as you can. That's going to pay dividends. So let's see. Oops, wrong side. So here. And all right. Oh, that's why it was just doing a question thing. Any other questions before we go on? Okay. Wow. 3 out of 6 so far here. So when we're talking about vegetation, again, vegetation is not an on-off switch. If you're looking at a creek from Google Earth imagery, for example, you'll be like, oh, wow, look, there's all sorts of stuff growing along the creek. It must be great for beavers. Well, is it? Because beavers eat some stuff and they don't eat other stuff. And not only are there kind of species-based preferences, like in general in Eastern Oregon, beaver don't like old alder to eat. There are individual preferences and based on their learning and experience over time. So like the finding that on some creeks, we find beavers that will know to eat the cattail shoots, or on one creek, they'll eat one species of tree and then they just won't even touch it on another creek just right nearby. So you do have to pay attention to what they're eating. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But what I'm getting at here is that when you've got your Goldilocks zone and you're like, all right, so I want to have, get to this 8,000 stem goal in my 1/2 to 3/4 mile long section of creek. There's no need to plant more than you have to. So if there's already good existing stuff there, you want to be able to count that towards your goal. And so you can eliminate numbers this way, but also locations. So you don't want to plant in an area where you've already got a bunch of little willow sprouts coming up. You want to make sure you know what kind of willow they are. But you don't want to mess up something that's already going for you. You want to be focusing on some other areas, so you're augmenting stuff. Again, don't just assume that because you've done land management changes, like, oh, well, we got the cows off this stretch, so we should just expect willow to explode up any time now, or we built BDAs and it's irrigating the landscape, so willows are going to explode up. That's that whole miracle diagram kind of thing that we were talking about, where people assume that's what's going to happen, and it doesn't always. And so you have to come in and augment with things. So when you're going out and looking at things, be really investigative. And sometimes you have to look at different times of the year. Sometimes things will sprout up and they'll get eaten down before you see they exist. That can be in the spring, and as beavers are moving around and dispersing. So what you see at one time of the year might not reflect what you see at other times of the year. Sometimes there won't be anything happening when vegetation is released from grazing pressure, and it takes a while and things just kind of sit there dormant for a while and then it explodes up. We've also had projects where nothing was growing there, and then a forest fire or a wildfire came through, and it kind of scarred the tops of some of the roots of aspen and cottonwoods and stuff, and it spurred growth all of a sudden. And so what's out there is going to change over the course of your project. So you have to keep tabs on that. And if you're doing multi-year planting strategy, you need to adjust that accordingly. If you're hoping things are going to come up and they're just not, well, you can't just keep hoping. Then you gotta plant more. When you have vegetation that's worthwhile out there and you find it, a lot of times I will build exclusion. Well, pretty much all the time. If it's few and far between, I will build exclosures around that existing vegetation. It seems mean to the beaver, but again, think of that 6-year-old eating all the cookie dough before you can have cookies. You gotta hold them off until it's ready, because otherwise they're gonna eat themselves out of house and home. So in general, when you're going out on the landscape to look at what's out there, after you've done it a few times, you can kind of just eyeball it. We're not talking about measuring anything with a micrometer here. We're more getting a general estimate, and a lot of things that I do are kind of in that range. We're not looking like, oh, well, we're 6 trees short. It's like there's a lot of trees, there's no trees, or you're somewhere in between, kind of thing. So a lot of times you can just eyeball it and get a, you know, an ocular estimate. But you also want to think of not just stems, but how big trees are, how dense they are. So when you look at metrics of how much vegetation is there, sometimes you'll hear, well, there's X acres of vegetation. Well, that needs a descriptor on it of, well, of what? Density and height, and you know, is it individual stems, or are they off, you know, multi-branching kind of things? Looking at really the volume or the mass of trees available. So when we're thinking about beaver food and what's worthwhile, we're thinking of these stems that are kind of bigger than a finger, kind of more like a thumb. Those are really prime targets for beaver food. Trunks are neat, but once they get really big, then they're getting kind of pithy and drier. And again, they're not eating that wood volume. They're just eating basically the skin on the outside, that inner cambium, the sap layer of that tree. And so it's really those branches and a lot of times the leaves that they're looking at. Let's see. So you can kind of eyeball it after you've done it a few times, but to start off with, you know, Reese kind of trained her eye, calibrated her eye by doing something that looked like this. And you can adapt this to what makes sense to you, or come up with your own idea. But this is what she was using, and to go through and really just commit to some kind of more specific metrics initially, just to understand what she was looking at on the landscape and how that translates to those metrics. Later, like I said, you can kind of do this in your head. And in most cases, what you'll find is that, there's not a lot of vegetation here and we got to do something. Or maybe this is looking pretty good. There's not a whole lot of gray areas in there, to be honest. So when we are looking at beaver sign, not everything that beaver chews on is actually food. So they have to do things like wearing down their teeth, and a lot of times they're going to be cutting down things that are for building materials, not for eating. So you have to kind of follow to the end result, if it's not obvious, of what's being used, what is being used for when they're chewing on things. And then even when beaver are eating something that you're like, wow, well, they eat that. Sometimes it's just purely out of a need to survive. And so I'm always talking about, like, you know, people stuck on a life raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean will drink their own urine to survive. That is not preference, that is survival. So sometimes if you're seeing them eating weird things, they're stuck in a life raft and they're doing it because they have to, not because they would want to, or because it's even any good for them at all. It's out of desperation. So understanding the context and not just saying, oh, a beaver ate this juniper tree and it fell over. Juniper is beaver food. It's not that simple. In my mind, that juniper tree, they chopped it down. That's just tooth maintenance. Maybe over the course of the days, they might drag that around and use it for construction material. If they're stuck in a life raft in the middle of the Pacific, they might harvest some of the smaller branches and soak those in the creek. And Reese has seen this on a number of her sites where they actually soak the juniper branches, and it kind of, we think maybe it releases the tannins. It makes them a little bit more palatable, but that is super survival kind of stuff. That's desperation kind of stuff. The pine tree that's knocked over there, that was just for tooth maintenance. Coyote willow, not to bash coyote willow, but coyote willow just really doesn't seem to be a super preference. You'll see them eat it. I think it's out of desperation. Like Reese was saying, it might be because oftentimes it's a really narrow diameter branch and they're looking for more volume there, being easier to carry down to a safer place to eat by the stream side. But also it has a high salicylic acid content. And so maybe it's a pretty effective defense mechanism. And just why I am bashing on coyote willow, it really is. I always call it the cockroach of the willow species, because it seems so able to survive well, since it spreads rhizomously, that any little chunk of coyote willow anywhere will spring up and grow into a big monoculture that then it's hard to get other stuff to grow in. And so if that's the thing that comes back most often and is most likely to be on the landscape, then that's the least priority for me to plant. Before I talk about sedges, yeah, Kelly, what's your question?
I had a question about coyote willow, and I think you kind of already addressed it. But what I was wondering if, since it's such a prevalent and like hardy species, if it's good for kind of like the beginning stages where you need to hold the bank steady, and then you can come in and then plant preferred grazing species, or if it's just like cheatgrass where once it gets in there, you don't want it.
Yeah, there's all sorts of confusing metaphors I could use for coyote willow, but it can be too much of a good thing. And I think planting coyote willow and its rhizominous spread, and it does things really quickly and it can prevent erosion. It kind of gets back to, all right, what are your objectives? If your objectives are like, oh my gosh, this creek is eroding and there's this head cut that's going to unzip this whole creek and we got to do some sort of bioengineering really quick to stop things. Yes, coyote willow, sure, I would put that in there. If your objective is really to work towards beaver managing floodplains, I just wouldn't prioritize it, because if you're planting coyote willow, you're not planting something else that is going to be more preferential. And it's like I say, it's going to create this monoculture that's going to be harder for things to spread on their own. Gotcha. If you're in some place where it's like, oh my gosh, I have to work here. I don't know if anything is ever going to grow here, and I need, the indestructible plant species to plant. Sure, go ahead. And we've seen that beaver will chew on it. They will use it for construction material and everything, but it's just not optimal. So I just don't prioritize it. I was just last year on my big planting, I actually didn't get to do plantings this spring, but last year my big planting, I included coyote willow, because in the drainage that we were working at the site we were working at, it wasn't really any coyote willow coming up on its own, and there should be some coyote willow out there. So I included a bunch of sticks, but I spread them out and made sure that there were other things growing in between. Does that help, Kelly?
Yeah, gotcha. That's perfect. Thank you.
Great. Other things, and again, the idea here is we're looking at what is out there already, so we're not planting more than we have to, or that maybe we need to plant more than we think. But remember that during the summer, yes, beavers will eat sedges and grasses and such. But in the fall, when those senesce, that's when they need that woody vegetation. And so this is the woody vegetation. They'll eat that throughout the year. They have to keep their teeth worn down, but that's what's going to carry them through the winter. And so a lot of these ephemeral beaver occupation sites that we see have a pattern of occupation until senescence of grasses and forbs and those sorts of things, weeds. Beaver will eat all sorts of things. And then once those go away, they start getting really hungry, and they'll either start wandering farther and farther afield to try to find food and get predated on, or they'll just leave. And if they're super young, they'll just go back to the mom and dad's natal site there and persist. So when you're seeing them eat sedges and grasses, that's great for summer food, and that will reduce the need for the woody veg in the summertime, but it's not going to keep them alive all year round. Another thing to really look for, and it'll look like that in the picture of the sedges and the grasses, is when they are eating cattail shoots. And they don't eat the whole green shoot. It's just the white part at the base of it that's fresh. It's like yummy asparagus kind of thing. You can eat it too if you wash it off. They'll just eat that little bit. So it just kind of cuts off the upper part of the cattail. And so you'll see a bunch of cattails floating around. That's great news. Because like I said, we've seen beavers basically persisting almost entirely on that, and systems with really low power flows made enormous dams out of nothing but mud and cattails. We're talking 30 feet tall, 70 feet long dams out of mud and cattails. Yeah, Andy, what you got?
So I know that muskrats also utilize cattails pretty. Is there a way to tell the difference between utilization by muskrats and utilization by beavers?
This is something I really appreciate Reese getting involved in, and that is getting trail cameras out on your creeks. And I would, if you think you've got beaver inhabiting an area over a long period of time, really, for me, it's not until I see like a pair throughout the year on trail camera and understanding what they're doing. But setting up a bunch of trail cameras to be like, all right, what's eating this kind of thing to see would be the only way I could think of getting at it. Because I wouldn't be able, you couldn't see like the tooth marks or something like that. Yeah, Reese.
Oh, I'm actually going to share a screenshot from that
Oh,
area.
yeah. Do you want me to stop sharing, or you got it?
No, I just put in the chat.
Oh, great.
So I don't know, Jefferson. I'm actually thinking where I do see the beavers going after the cattail. I just want to add that it's very evident because they have that angular look on it. Like you can always see that angular cut. And Andy, I don't know if my sense of things is that the muskrat are going for the sedges and sometimes the rushes, but more often it's the sedges. They're more manageable. I think it's the beavers that are really going after the cattails. And like the photo in the chat that I just sent you, this is that dam. And if you go up to one of those cattails, because I always check when I'm out looking to see if they're actually harvesting these cattails or not, or whether some other animal just knocked it over. You can always see a pretty evident. It's pretty evident on the bottom that it's been a beaver that harvested that. And I'm seeing that on a lot of streams where I'm not seeing any muskrat in my trail cameras, and I'm thinking they're probably getting eaten by otters or other critters, but they're just not there. But yeah, on the photo in the chat, all of those, this is that incised channel. I think this is one of about 6 dams in there, and this is about 80 to 100 feet wide incised channel. And these dams are just massive, and they're entirely constructed out of cattails. So if you were to go and pull one of these cattails, all of them would have that telltale sign with the angular bottom.
Awesome. Yeah, Reese has the best natural history observations of beaver, and spends so much time making these observations. Is really I should have just deferred that question to you right from the start. So some other things that we see, you know, that they'll eat when they're desperate are golden currant and dogwood. But on the east side of the mountains, really both golden currant and dogwood are signs that they're not eating what they really want to. They will eat the little green shoots of alder once they've chopped alder down, either for their teeth or for building material. They'll eat the little new green shoots I've seen. But I mean, you look at alder and it's not hard to see why they wouldn't eat it. It's always good to put yourself in the place of the beaver. It's just pithy. It would be like biting into a bag of ground flax seeds or something. It just is the worst bran muffin ever. So not hard to see why they wouldn't be eating that. Sagebrush, just was out on South Fork Crooked and was looking at all these sagebrush that a beaver had chopped down. And the guy I was with was like, "Oh, are they eating these sagebrush?" And I'm like, I don't think so. Let's look around. And you always have to look at the next step. It wasn't like they cut down sagebrush and then it was laying right next to the stump. There was just these stumps and no sagebrush around. And we walked another 100 feet up the creek, and sure enough, they're dragging all these sagebrush clumps up to put on top of their bank den. There's a couple of reasons for that. And one, I think it keeps heavy animals from walking on top of it and collapsing it down. Just like when you make a snow cave, you poke your ski poles and your skis in there so you don't forget and walk into your own snow cave. But also it provides a little structure and a little extra defense from things digging in, that sort of thing. When you're looking at those things, you have to kind of not assume that basically, don't mistake occasional signs of beaver chew for beaver occupancy. Just because there's some tree that's been chewed by beaver or a couple of willows chewed by beaver doesn't mean a beaver is actually already living there, or that represents good beaver habitat already. Beaver are dispersing throughout the year, most intensely in the springtime, but then potentially coming back in the fall if they didn't have a good site again. And so they're going to basically leave the equivalent of candy wrappers out on a hiking trail along the way. So as they stop for a snack, or their teeth were hurting them and so they had to chew on something, but it doesn't mean that they actually live there. And that's a lot harder to establish the occupancy. So some things that are beaver signs that are showing that they are sticking around for longer are really persistent or larger feeding benches where you're seeing a lot of accumulation, especially if it looks like different ages of kind of aged sticks there. Persistent dam repair, especially as water levels change. If you see a blown out dam and no repair, that's not a good sign. But if you see a blown out dam that then is repaired, then that's a good sign. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to add to that. We're just now starting, the waters are just now slow enough that we're starting to see that activity. They're not going to do repair until the waters are as slow as possible, especially if they have enough cover with the high flows. They're not going to do that. Yeah, put energy to that.
Yeah, that's the nice thing. They're only going to build dams as big as they need them and when they need them. Last thing is these scent mounds. I don't have a particularly good sense of smell, but other people that I've been out with, my daughter can pick these up from 20 feet away, it seems like. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll start looking for a scent mound. Those are all territorial things. But again, context in a seasonality kind of situation of, if I'm seeing signs like this and it's spring, well, that's great. They're there now, but are they year round? Are they there for multiple years? And so a dispersing juvenile in the spring or that's been there through the summer will repair dams. It'll have feeding benches. It'll have scent mounds, but it also might still run out of food in the fall and have to leave. Or it might suffer from dewatering of a creek in the summer, for example, or things like its den getting collapsed in by trampling or something like that from big animals. And so these signs are really persistent, and they might out persist the occupancy of the animal that made them. So you have to think about in the context in which they're being made. One thing that's nice though is that oftentimes if you're seeing things like this, they'll make you go back and look for other clues. And so those beavers on Hay Creek, for example, that were eating so many cattails, I kind of feel like once we, I think it was with your trail cameras, Reese, that really established that, oh, we have beavers really living here and they're persistent. And we're like, what the heck are they eating? And then we're looking more at the cattails. We're like, oh, wow, they actually are persisting just on cattails. It made us flip the question of what they're eating, or are they there, kind of thing. So it's good to just keep questioning. You never really know what's going on, so that don't think you do.
And then I'll just add to that, there's a lot of places where I don't see them touch the cattails at all.
Yes.
So it just happened to be these beavers made use of the cattails, and for whatever reason, that was a viable source for them. And they've persisted. They've been there, I think, probably about 10 years.
Yep.
From Google Earth. Yeah. And
I think that is just through learning. And it's another good reason why having really aiming towards a persistent beaver colony that's in a watershed, and learning what's available, what isn't, and learning the ways of that watershed, and then teaching it to their next generation is really important. Otherwise, you just keep getting these newbie kind of idiot dispersing males coming in, and they don't really know what's going on or what resources are available to them. So it might be a really unappreciated portion of that multi-generational aspect. But also, if a beaver is coming from an area that doesn't have a lot of cattails, like just the main stem of the John Day on the lower end, where it's super gravel bars and you're getting coyote willow and that's it, they just might have just no idea, just didn't get exposed to that in their life. So again, getting them in, getting them used to it, giving them chances to explore around and stuff is pretty important. So as we're kind of continuing through here to eliminate areas to plant within that Goldilocks zone, you want to plant, of course, where there aren't pre-existing plants already coming up, but do protect those, because the beavers will eat those and they can just keep them from ever getting anywhere. But don't plant where there already are plants. We'll need to eliminate some pretty large areas based on some really basic stuff, and that is and this is one of my big take-home messages from today, is assessing diggability, which I don't know if that's a real word, but it's the ability to dig a hole, and it's useful. So the diggability of a site, and the depth to suitable soil moisture. So that's what we're going to kind of talk about more in this section. So diggability is really a big thing, and really diggability and soil moisture too. The only way you can figure this out is by going out and digging holes. There isn't really a shortcut to this. Soil maps are going to show you such generalized area, and they're not going to be so the scale of it isn't going to be such that it's going to show you what the soil type is on an individual floodplain that's eroded down after that soil map was made. Maybe it's and each floodplain and different parts of floodplains are going to be really distinct and unique. So it sounds like a pain in the butt, and it is, but it gives you this X-ray vision into the ground just by digging these holes. So just starting with diggability, it's a huge deal. I've collaborated on a lot of different projects where my role was just simply to provide volunteer labor with my Onda volunteers, and we show up and we get pointed, you know, these plants need to go in on that inset floodplain, and we go over there and we take our first shovel and it just bounces off, and it's literally bedrock under 3 inches of soil. And then we're left during the implementation phase of when we should be planting things, scrambling around looking for anywhere where we can get just even a shovel in the ground. And so just a little bit of planning really would have helped eliminate those sites and made those planting days a lot more efficient. When I'm doing diggability or soil moisture pits, and they're the same thing, I'm doing that at the time of year when it's driest. So on most creeks in Eastern Oregon, that's kind of August, early September. You want to do it before you get the rains coming back again, and water levels might be coming up or irrigation is being turned off. You want to catch it at the lowest time. So that's another reason why to start early, is to understand when that lowest time is on your creek, because it may not be what you're thinking. Understanding that in Eastern Oregon, you're not getting moisture from the top down during those summer months. There's not water filtering through from precipitation. Your plants are going to be 100% dependent on water that's coming up from that water table that's emanating out from the creek. So you're trying to drill down and see what's there. The whole reason for this, again, collaborating a lot of different projects and making this mistake myself, is that the time of year when we're doing planting is the springtime, really early in the spring and really late in the fall. And at those times of year, all soil moisture looks fantastic. Either the creek is up and it just was flooding the floodplain and everything is just mucky and fabulous, or the rains have inundated, and so the top several inches are all nice and wet, and things are going into winter, and it's not getting baked out. So you can get suckered into these death traps for planting that it looks great now, but in August are literally just dry sandboxes when your plants still need water. So again, you got to dig these holes, or auger holes, and it's easy to think that you can use kind of shortcuts to get around digging holes. It's like, well, look, there's willows growing over there. There must be good soil moisture. Look at all these little shoots coming up. Well, those little shoots might be coming up from roots that established 50 years ago when the creek was much higher, and they might be 50-year-old willows, root systems that are vast and deep, and might not have anything to do with the depth zone in which you're hoping to plant. And so that also can sucker you into things like that. I mean, I run along the old irrigation canal trails in Bend, where the irrigation canal is now in a pipe, and it's a desert with ponderosa trees, and there are still willows persisting there. Those willows can survive after they've been established, but you would never try to plant a willow tree in that area where there's no water from leaking out from the irrigation canal anymore, because it's in a pipe. So don't get suckered in by existing vegetation. The other kind of vegetation that can kind of sucker us into thinking that's going to be a good site is stuff like teasel, or other stuff that just greens up so much and looks really healthy and vibrant in the spring. And we could think, oh, well, that's good soil moisture there. Well, teasel doesn't have, they can survive just that first month off of really shallow water, and then either go dormant for their second year or just die off. it doesn't, again, represent that year-round water that you need, and or at the depths that you're hoping to reach. So that's another thing that can sucker us in. Another thing is that, you'll be looking at Google Earth and you're like, oh, look at this inside of this curve and it's all green. That's got to be great area, because clearly, the hyporheic flow, there's water flowing, kind of cutting the corner there and flowing underneath that. Well, a lot of those inside corners are deposited with sands and gravels and that sort of thing, and maybe not organic sediments, depending on what your source is. And so it allows water to flow through, and when water is there, it's there. But as soon as your water table drops, it drains just as easily as it flows through. And so when the water table drops later in the season, those areas can just dry up. And so you don't know any of this until you go and you dig holes during August. And again and again and again, every time I'll auger a hole and I think I know what's going to happen and what it's going to look like in there, I get fooled. So other things that happen are that in Eastern Oregon, we have such fine soils that if they're really uniform, this is really common in former agricultural fields where they've been tilled and rocks removed and that sort of stuff, and it's just fine dust, it becomes impenetrable to water. And we've done auger tests where we've started far away from the creek and augered closer and closer and closer and closer, looking for soil moisture. And it sounds insane, and I wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it myself, but literally the water was ready to splash into the hole over the top. We were so close to the creek, and it was a bone dry hole 4 feet deep. It's just a hydrophobic soil, and it's another reason why you can't really depend on rainwater watering your plants. Things that are good news that you can find when you're augering are that there'll sometimes be these gravel lenses or old creek beds that are filtering water through, and you'll actually end up, by exploring around within that Goldilocks zone with an auger, you'll find unexpectedly good places that have water that you wouldn't expect. And as long as it's there in August or September, don't ask questions. It's just good, and go with it. Those are real nice wins. So don't assume anything, and do the work to investigate that. And honest to goodness, that is the single most effective thing that I've done that has improved my plant survival more than anything else. Probably, well, with caging or with exclosure fences, but in the actual planting, it's this site selection that's really been important. So when I'm going out, and I'll get to a new slide here in a second, but when I'm going out, I like to use, if I can, an auger, which I have a picture of in a second, but I'll use a walk behind Toro Dingo auger, just to let you picture. Oh, no, it's not there yet. That lets me just, in 30 seconds, I auger a hole 4 feet deep. I'm like a sewing machine going down the creek, all within my Goldilocks zone. And so you can see a picture here that shows when I map out the results of those holes. So I'm looking at both soil moisture and diggability, and I'll talk about kind of the metrics that I use to kind of color code some of these holes. But once you map things out like this, you start seeing kind of clusters of things, and you're like, I've got a lot of green holes here. That's a nice area. I'll build an exclosure there, and don't bother building it where it's red. What's useful about an auger is that it represents pretty much the maximum depth I'm going to be able to do anything at. And so even if I'm going to do potted plants, I'm looking at an area where I have to plant potted plants for various reasons. I will still test with an auger if I can, because by going deeper than I hope to plant, if I just dug a hole to 14 inches and didn't find water, I'd be like, oh, well, it's no good there. But if I go deeper than 14 inches and I find water just below that, then to me that says, oh, this is maybe within reach if I build a beaver dam analog here, a BDA here, and can bump that water table up a few inches. And so I'll put that in my notes for the specific hole as to, well, this is an orange right now, but maybe it could be a green one if I did BDAs. So I always recommend digging your pits deeper than you're actually planning on planting. The other thing about using the auger is you really get to test assumptions about accessibility. Your planting day, when you're gonna go out and you're like, yep, and this area is where I'm gonna auger, and then you realize you can't get down the bank or something like that. That's a little too late. So it lets you test whether or not you can actually get kind of the highest level of equipment down in those areas. When I'm digging these test pits, they look pretty close here, but really I'm kind of spreading them out 25, 50 feet apart. And if I'm picking up on patterns in a floodplain, maybe I'll make them bigger or smaller depending on that, or just trying to maybe get closer together as I'm trying to figure out where the edge of the good planting is. If you can't get an auger in, then you're going to be digging holes by hand, and my test holes then become very far spaced and increasingly far spaced as the day goes on, as I go along. But you still need to figure it out. If you're going to be planting cuttings by banging in a pike and then pulling the pike out and shoving the stick in the hole, I still like to look at an actual dug hole, because if I'm just testing by planting a pike, all that tells me really is, can I get a pike in the ground? It's not telling me what that substrate is. Is this like sand that's going to drain really quickly or fill really quickly? Is it going to be, a nice clay? Is this all like a super crazy root mat that's going to be competing with the plants or not? So when I'm trying to color code these test pits, I am looking at soil moisture and diggability, and let's talk about some of those specific metrics of how I'm kind of rating these things. So suitable soil moisture rules of thumb are, if I'm augering a hole, so like a 4-foot hole, I like to have 75%, the lower 75%, because you don't want rainwater influence. You want the up from the stream bottom moisture. So that lower 75% to have soil that's moist enough to make a snowball that sticks together, a dirt ball there that sticks together in fine grains. But sometimes with sand and stuff, it won't actually fully stick together just because of the grain size. But if you pull it out and you're like, oh, that's wet, then like that would be too wet to sit on comfortably. That's great. That's fine. And so that's kind of the moist enough. When you're getting into the area where you're worrying about, is it too moist, is that if you have a hole that's going to be more than 75% of that level of moist, more than 75% full of standing water, or for potted plants, about 30% of that 14-inch hole full of standing water. What that tells me is, like, you never know if you're getting like a super dry year, or not hitting the hydrological cycle at the driest or wettest part. You might just be kind of a little off, And so that's getting really near the situation where it's going to be so wet that those plants are going to get drowned out. There's a parenchyma tissue where plants can shove oxygen down into their roots from above, but the plants that we're planting don't have that, and they have to have at least some part of their root system in soil with air and out of the water. So you don't want to overdo the water bit. So I'm looking at soil moisture, but then I'm also looking at diggability. Here with a green check mark, you can see that Toro Dingo augering along, and have a volunteer running that. Did a great job. It's once you learn the controls, it's really easy. I'm not talking about a hand powered auger, handheld auger like this. That's great if you're going to auger like 2 holes, but after that it's exhausting. So that hand auger weighs about 35 pounds. So just lifting that up, nothing else, but lifting that up out of a hole, you're talking about augering thousands of holes. That's exhausting for planting or just doing test bits. In reality, you never just get to lift it cleanly out of the hole. It gets caught on rocks, it gets caught on roots, and I've tried, and I'm not a wimp, but it did me in really quickly. And so I don't recommend that as a real go-to tool. The other thing is that if it's powerful enough to really auger through some of the stuff that you'll encounter along a creek, it can get kind of dangerous, especially towards the end of the day when people get tired and it gets caught on a rock and it twists around. It can chuck you around or whap you pretty hard. So I don't recommend that. But when I'm looking at diggability, I'm like, the first thing is, can you dig a hole there at all? And it seems like a simple question, but it's one that just doesn't even get asked. When you're looking at soil structure, if you're augering a bunch of holes and they're super gravelly and sandy, they're going to collapse in. So the hole you dig initially might not be the hole that the person following along behind you gets, 5 minutes later, and it's collapsed in and they can't get a stick all the way down to the good stuff that you auger down to when you're doing your planting. So gravel holes are less desirable, and you may need to either find a different place to plant or a different way to do that. Sometimes I don't like using big equipment and stuff, but sometimes I've worked on projects where they been lucky enough to have like a little mini excavator, and they can dig a hole and it collapses in, but you can still put the sticks in. So yeah, bedrock or even just embedded cobble might be undiggable. And really, those areas aren't places where you're going to get the best benefits from beaver anyway, because you're not going to have a lot of good hyperrheic flow and lots of surface area there for biology to clean water and that sort of stuff going on. So you're kind of encouraging beaver to be on a place where they're not going to have that ground sponge for impacting the hydrology and stuff. So even beyond just the fact that it's tough to plant there, it's not going to give you the benefits that you're looking for probably long term. Those fine uniform soils might be hydrophobic. I was describing that earlier. And then when you're digging, so reed canary grass and a lot of other sedges and stuff, I guess during the Willow workshop, they were learning that don't plant out your sedge meadows. Well, a lot of those meadows have such a deep, foot and a half deep root mass that there's not even dirt there. And so you can plant in that. And I often will plant in reed canary grass areas that have a foot and a half root mass. If you get your stick past that into the deeper water, it doesn't matter that there's a root mass there. It's not competition or anything. The stick has outrun them down to the water already. But what it means is that if you're augering holes and you're planting a stick there, you're going to need to source dirt from elsewhere to backfill into that hole. And that's a logistics consideration that you're going to have to think of, because it takes a surprising amount of dirt to backfill a 6-inch auger hole. And even if you're in a regular dirt hole, without those root mats, so much gets pressed against the side and such, you never end up with exactly how much dirt you need to backfill a hole. If you're using dirt from elsewhere, you'll want to moisten it if you're just getting dry, dusty stuff. But we are always just grabbing dirt from the uplands, moisten it a little bit in a bucket, and then it allows you to pour it in and tamp in, and it works great. Yeah, Reese. You had your hand up?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was wondering on the reed canary grass, because I know that's a big thing. Oh, you're going to talk about that, I think. How do you outcompete the reed canary grass? But you've done that before, and actually, I just realized I think you're going to be talking about that, because you have not only the root mass down below, but also that stuff gets really, really high. And yeah, okay. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's not, and I don't mind talking about things multiple times, because I think it's good to kind of revisit them. But yeah, one way to deal with that for the life of the plant is to plant down below it, so you're not actually competing for the water source. The other is, we'll talk about this and show pictures, if you need to plant potted plants, and the water is there for them, but they're going to be sitting in that same root mass, because that's how deep the root mass is, exact depth of a pot. Then we use the cardboard weed mat to hamper the competition there for several years. But really, the end result is you're never going to get rid of the reed canary grass. But if you're planting at the densities that we're talking about planting at 18,000 stems per half, 3/4 mile, that's 6,000 stems per acre, basically, if you're looking at 3 acres. Those densities, one every 1.5 feet, couple feet, it's once those plants get established, they're going to create enough shade that they're really going to decrease the influence of reed canary grass in a big exclosure. If it's a small exclosure, there's enough side light that gets in, it's less effective. But if you're talking about big volumes, that's a really effective tool. So I think we're coming close to the end of 4 here, and we'll be able to finish up by 12:15. Yeah, is that a fresh raised hand, Reese?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah, one of the things that I don't think we talked about, but can you talk generally about the cost on all of this and these, I guess it came up for me when we talked about planting an acre and then, or 3 acre, like what are you looking at in terms of just, and if you assumed we use contractors, not volunteers, have you got a sense of what a treatment reach would be? And I know it would be more if there's BDAs or less if there's not, but do you have kind of a ballpark of what it might cost if you assume there was nothing to work with from the beginning?
Yeah, I've had to do this for a bunch of different grants, and and you're paying for this portion of it kind of thing. And I have zero experience with contractors, since we do all our own work and it's volunteer based. But usually if I'm establishing a BeaverHOOD from scratch and I get to do things the way I want, and on the timeline that I want, in a nice intensity, I'm thinking kind of in the $60,000 per BeaverHOOD range, kind of start to finish. We can do it there. If you're thinking about all the time, kind of, it gets a little squishy in terms of staff time of going out and looking at things ahead of time beforehand. But if you're already slightly familiar with a creek and not having to do a whole lot of pre-homework, that's pretty easy to achieve, and that includes fencing, renting The equipment that auger is $600 for a week, and you can pull it on a trailer behind a pickup truck, and so it's not that insurmountable. And it runs all day on a tank and a half of diesel, and so it works great. With that as well, you were there when we were planting 5,000 sticks, 5,000 cuttings in a weekend, and so it doesn't take, if you have a good crew, it doesn't take very long to do the planting part. The BDAs, there's a lot of flexibility there, and if you're including hours for permitting and that sort of thing, that can really up your costs, because that's a really slow process. But this isn't the multi-million-dollar kind of thing of the Tonka trucks. The fencing that we use is about $100 for 100 foot roll, so about $1 a fence, $1 a foot, and the T-posts were, for us, we're recycling from other projects, and we pull fence in one area and put it in another area, but you're not using tons and tons of fence posts if you're doing exclosures that are about 200 foot in circumference. You're really trying to maximize the area to fencing material at that point. Again, that's why I don't do cages. Really, there are cages left over on some of my projects where I was experimenting with things, but you just can't get the volume of trees that we've found that you need by doing individual cages. You got $60 per plant just in caging material there and labor. So that's just absurd. So you have more kind of experience with some of the contracting crews and that stuff. So I would defer more to you on that end of things.
So the 60K is without the labor for installation and without project management?
That's my time and using volunteers pretty much start to finish on a Beaver.
Okay. Yeah, I think the labor contracts that I've seen are anywhere between $1 to $3 per planting, and that includes a caging. So if we did 10,000, then 10,000 plants, I would assume. So that's just for the labor piece, hired contractor help. So I'd figure probably about $20,000 for 10,000 trees, maybe 20 to 30,000. Andy, I wonder too if you've had have other ranges that you've seen as well as some of your projects in terms of labor piece.
Yeah, I was trying to look up what we got charged for our Camp Creek project that we just finished.
You had volunteer help on that too.
Yeah, but we had oh, I'm in the wrong folder, that's why I can't find it. So we had, our potted plants were entirely handled by
Professionals.
So let's see here.
Yeah, if you're doing a ton of potted plants, I mean, that could be $20,000 in plants alone pretty quick.
So we did, I think we did 2,500 potted plants.
Okay.
And basically for the plants and labor, it was 58,000.
Okay.
But that was also including a big chunk of, about half of the labor was caging.
Yeah.
With individual cages. So I mean, theoretically, you can make that labor go down quite a bit if you were doing mass caging.
So 58,000 divided by 2,500, that's about $2. $2 a plant. Oh, I did that wrong. Sorry. $23 a plant. I missed an O. Yeah.
I want to say they quoted me $12 a plant to to buy the plant and put it in the ground was $12 a piece.
Okay. Okay. So if the
And-
plant was probably $6 or $7, I'm guessing, for 1 gallon, then
Yeah,
that
and
might have been about $4 or $5 of
we had
labor.
a significant amount of labor on the SWCD side of staging the plants because they were
Yeah.
all over the place. And
Yep.
so there was a lot of like Jefferson indicated, there's a lot of pre-work that had to go into it
Yeah.
that wasn't necessarily costs that were incurred by the contractor.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. That feels like Jefferson, something we could get better at kind of articulating, or at least giving folks an idea. And we're working on some scope right now for our project, our post project, Andy. So I can put some numbers out to this group if it's of interest in the future. Sorry to interrupt you, Jefferson, put you on the spot there, but yeah, just kind of came up. I think we might have lost Jefferson. Well, I'm gonna.
Maybe you guys covered it, but what's the density that you recommend planting potted plants at?
Let me see if he's gonna cover this in here. I'm doing, actually, I think he might cover this, but for my projects, and I've pretty much been following from his playbook. For my projects, I've been doing about 1.5 to 2 feet of spacing. And on the cuttings, I'll plant multiple stems per hole. So anywhere from 3 to 5 cuttings per hole. So in a 200, in one of these enclosures where you're using 200 linear feet of fencing, forgot the math on that. That's actually pretty big. 100 linear feet of fencing. You could probably fit like 1,500 cuttings in there, and I think I get I could fit about 150 cuttings in there, and then I'd have like 3 per hole within that enclosure. Those are like on smaller areas. Jefferson's been able to find some planting locations that are much bigger, and using the Toro Dingo, I think, really helps. And he's been building enclosures that are, 30 by 100 feet long, Jefferson. And he was asking about the density on plantings.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Zoom just kicked me out there for some reason. So, yeah, I like to keep my exposures kind of max 200 feet circumference. So 2 rolls of fence, because if I get bigger than that, I feel like I'm putting too many eggs in one basket. And by keeping the exposures kind of in a middle ground, not gigantic, where you're getting great, fence to plant ratios, there's just so many places where, yeah, so here are some of the sizes. By keeping them small, it allows animals and people to move through for working. If something happens to one exclosure, you're not going to lose all your plants. They also kind of help protect each other a little bit. So that's what I like in terms of exclosure size. In terms of densities, you can see here we're putting 4 to sometimes 6 sticks, cuttings in each hole, usually more like 3 to 4 in each hole. And as long as they're down all to water, they're not going to compete with each other. In the nature and wild, you will find willows and cottonwoods growing at these densities. Just behind it, you can see established exclosures that are older, where we planted in these densities, and they're all doing great and shading out weeds and doing fine because they have enough soil moisture thanks to pre-planting. What you'll want to be careful when you're doing this, this come up again later, is that each one of those cuttings needs to have good soil contact with it. So if you have them too bunched up, like in a quiver of arrows, then there's going to be too many air pockets in there and they might dry out, or it's not going to cue root growth. But if you spread them out and you can tamp down gently in between there and make sure there's no air pockets, they'll do fine. And really the density limit of planting was more driven by how close I could drive the Toro Dingo next to the previous line of holes without collapsing in the holes or running over sticks, and more than what the density of plants that can survive. There's papers on planting at really high densities and having success specifically to shade out reed canary grass. But in the nursery, they're planting at foot wide intervals, and it's ideal. And then you're harvesting off of them all the time. So there's really not a big problem with that.
So Jefferson, I'm wondering, it's 12 after 10. Do we want to take a 15-minute break? Is this a good time? And then I think you've got the 4, 5, and 6 remaining.
That works great for me. I really appreciate everybody sticking around and those of you asking questions and everything. I know this is just me blabbing a lot, but I'm so excited to get to share this information and get it to you, not because I think I know something, but because I really don't want people making the same mistakes that I've made, and to avoid those problems. So I'm excited that this just might be helpful to anyone, basically, and we'll just get more beavers on the landscape. So thanks for being patient, and do maybe think of some questions over the course of lunch, and we'll get back to it at
12:30.
12:30. Okay, 12:30.
Yeah, just a quickie. Yeah. So so see everyone at 12:30. Thanks, Jefferson.
Thank you. Just talking about, just because
Sorry.
we're really focusing on beaver right here doesn't mean that's the only and most important part. It's just that we have to containerize some of the conversations, but absolutely. And I frequently am including all sorts of plantings that have nothing to do with beaver and that sort of stuff, where I can do that additionally at the same time. But if I have to prioritize, first off, I'm going to prioritize beaver so we can get the system alive again, basically putting the paddles on it and jumpstarting it. And then we'll have more to work with and be more successful in doing a lot of those other things. But yeah, not a whole lot of experience with not really a whole lot of seeding with the beaver stuff. And then Ashley's question was about.
I was just asking if you could share those publications of their names so that I could find them, because it's very interesting to me to look into that and maybe use it as a tool.
Yep. So just Chris Hogue, that's the kind of the godfather of all willow planting stuff. He has all sorts of publications about cluster planting and that sort of thing. And if you want specific citations, I can get those afterwards and share them out through Kelly or Reese to the group. So those are great foundational things to kind of reassure you that yes, it's okay to cluster plant and have these high densities. But one that I always go to in terms of reed canary grass and such is a study that was done up on Lake Washington there in Seattle, where they were planting willow sticks at various densities up to, I think it was like one every half foot or something like that, and seeing the effects on the reed canary grass afterwards. And they were getting great success, and they were saying basically the take-home message was the denser the better. And I always go back to my youth growing up in Maine, or in seeing some of the various places where it's gotten kind of wild again in Eastern Oregon. And things can grow so impenetrably thick. It is just mind blowing. And you'll just see a little cottonwood just waiting until there's a break in the canopy, or it can shoot up somehow, waiting there in the shade. And it is remarkable how dense things can be, as long as there's enough water to go around, and depth of that. So yeah, but I can send those specific papers out afterwards. Great. Other questions before we go or start again? Well, I'm gonna go back a couple of slides, because as I was starting to eat lunch here, I was thinking, oh, I don't want to give the impression with this Goldilocks zone. I just backed up a couple of seconds, that this is just a one inset floodplain out of a longer reach, out of a 3/4 mile long reach that you would be investigating of where to do your test pits. You want to do this over a big range, and sometimes we'll do it over several miles. It's not that hard to draw lines with Google Earth, and it'll help you then zero in on those pearls on the string that I was talking about, of where you thought you might be wanting to look over here, but really the topography there is a little bit different than it just kind of looks like on Google Earth, and it'll help direct you to areas where there's maybe better concentrations of inset floodplains, or steer you away from areas where you didn't think it was that steep, but in reality it is, and there's not a lot of geography there. So I just didn't want you to think that we're only looking at one little 100-foot long inset floodplain at a time. We're looking at bigger areas. Yeah, Seth, what's your question?
Hi, I was wondering, do you ever get heterogeneity in your topography and the soils in that Goldilocks zone that would dictate which species you're planting?
That's a great question. And people can overthink and try to over-science things sometimes. And so, whereas it seems like sometimes, as long as you got lots of diversity and your bases covered, it kind of works out. So I haven't done anything where I'm like, every soil pit I'm checking, soil chemistry and exactly doing soil type classifications or something. I'm keeping it pretty broad level, but that diversity that we find on the landscape, and that these inset floodplains they're almost never uniform, that you're going to get areas on the upstream end that are big piles of buried cobble, and then it gets into more silty stuff behind that where it washed up. You're going to get lenses, you're going to get some giant boulder there that's the reason why the stream didn't erode down there. That you get all those different substrate heterogeneity, and you could look at trying to match exact plants with exact locations, and put a lot of thought into that. What I tend to do is by having all sorts of different willows with very different kind of preferences for inundation and or cottonwood that can live on drier areas, or aspen that don't look like being super underwater all the time. By spreading that all over, I find enough of the time, a high percentage of the time, I'm getting things that are surviving there. The other thing is that none of this is static. You are planting and collaborating with a really dynamic system and a really dynamic ecosystem engineer of beaver. And so what you might be planting in now might not be what it is 10 years later. So having something everywhere kind of covers the spatial heterogeneity and the temporal heterogeneity as well. And so it's a little, I don't like scattershot approaches typically, and just, throwing a dart at the dartboard, but I'm throwing a lot of darts out there, and if they're relatively inexpensive, and I'm otherwise getting things really dialed in, it seems to be working for me so far. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks. That makes total sense.
The other thing about heterogeneity too is that elevational heterogeneity is nice, because as beavers are raising and lowering water levels, they are they're going to be flooding out areas and not flooding out areas. And so if it was all exactly completely flat, they raise it up and flood that out, well, then that's just all flooded out. And unless it dries out sometime of the year, you're going to lose all your willows there. So having bumpy terrain is actually kind of good, if you can find it. So that's why it's nice within that Goldilocks zone. There's, you know, a big 4-foot range of topography that you can potentially be in. All right, so we talked about all that. So this is the slide we ended on. And again, if other questions come up, please just go ahead and chime in. This is telling you what you want to know. So let me know what you want to know. Beaver dam analogs. So I had mentioned BDAs earlier and how you can use them to change water levels to help irrigate your plants. But I really see BDAs, or have come to appreciate BDAs, and ONDA, and I started at ONDA, the organization I work for, in 2000, the winter of 2008. So that season, right when the work at Bridge Creek was starting, and we were involved at Bridge Creek and the genesis of BDAs there. And I really see them as a means to an end, not an end to themselves. If your end goal is to have beavers managing your floodplains, then your beaver dam analogs are really going to be a temporary tool with a very specific goal in mind on how they are getting you to that end goal of beavers managing the landscape. So really the only time I use beaver dam analogs are 99% of the time to increase soil moisture for my plantings, and sometimes in some strategies with lots of them over a long area to try to dampen stream power. So I am having a little bit more predictable water flows and not blasting things out. So in that respect, there's a lot of different ways you could use beaver dam analogs, like there's bank blasters where you set them up and then the water comes down and shoots against a bank and it erodes it, and it helps create inset floodplains and all of that. And there might be applications for that where maybe beavers aren't an appropriate kind of collaborator in a certain situation because there's too much infrastructure and humans feel like they have to do it themselves. But really, any of that to me is kind of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and I'd rather just get faster to the point where beavers are in charge and they can just completely go crazy and improve a landscape, rather than me with human hubris thinking that I'm going to be doing a lot with these little bank blasters, because then you have to maintain them, and as they blast the bank out farther, you have to keep building them out towards the bank and stuff. And I don't have time for that. I'd rather get food for the beavers and have them build 10-foot tall dams and just reconnect floodplains and stuff. So so having said that, beaver dam analogs are really valuable for improving water flows and irrigation for plantings. Not in so much that they reconnect the floodplains and the water soaks down, so much as during the low flows, they keep it from going all the way back down to empty. It always kind of can keep that tank half full. And so in August, I know there's going to be something there. Otherwise, the bottom would just drop out. The other thing with BDAs is that if you are using BDAs, really affects your timeline because you have to have permitting and you have to do all your soil moisture stuff beforehand to understand, do I even need BDAs, or is the soil moisture good right there? And if I do need BDAs, where would they be useful? Because you don't want to just willy-nilly build BDAs because you might raise your water level to a point where then it's not good planting and you went through all that trouble for a BDA. Or you might build a BDA in an area that you find has those hydrophobic soils and isn't going to infiltrate in, that sort of stuff. So you want to be really careful about where you're building them and build them where they're going to be valuable. But having said that, their effect, their impact, their hoped for impact could work or it could not. And you have to then resurvey your soil moisture again after you've built them to see what they really did. I've built BDAs on inset floodplains that did nothing to improve things, just because there was some barrier that I didn't know about to water moving off to the side, or for whatever reason, it didn't work. And other places where I did it and it was immediately noticeable, and the planting just exponentially acreage increased. Under ideal circumstances, I would be building BDAs for my plants in one season, and then seeing how they go through the spring flood season. So I understand, like there was that picture we were showing earlier about the BDA that was kind of shooting the water over it at an exclosure, just because there wasn't a chance because of the timeline to see how that BDA and that floodplain were going to interact. I like to build my BDAs 1 year and then have them be through that flood cycle, and then check my water levels after I've repaired them that next August to see how and if they've improved the water table at all. Because you don't assume anything. The other thing is that it can be dangerous if you are planting and then building BDAs, because I made that mistake. I made every mistake. I've planted and then built BDAs, and then they had insane reactions where they backed water way up farther than was modeled to happen by fancy, intelligent people farther upstream. And I literally had potted plants floating up out of the ground over the course of the week. And so that was horrible. That was a lot of time and money wasted. And I had to then go tear out those BDAs. It's hard to predict. Sometimes it's a really small reaction from BDAs. In that case, we could see in the dry dirt, 1.5 feet above the surface of the water, this really wet line where the capillary action drew the water up above the surface of the water. So we're actually, with those BDAs on the creek that was South Fork Crooked, we were able to plant in these absurd high places that you never would have guessed. But thanks to the BDA and that capillary action, it worked. And you can't just model that stuff. You just have to suck it up and admit you're not going to really know what's going to happen. So I get my hackles up a little bit when I hear people talking about a BDA project. If you're doing a BDA project, you're focused on BDAs and you're not really focused on beavers. If you're doing a beaver project, BDAs might be a tool to help you get beaver habitat. It's just like you wouldn't refer to, constructing a house as a hammer project. No, that the hammer is a tool towards achieving an end, and vice versa. So that's my little rant on BDAs. And actually, sometime earlier, I think I already touched on this idea of the existing vegetation is not a good cue of soil moisture. Any questions? You can ask questions all the time. You don't have to wait till the little question queue comes up. Right, 5 out of 6, and we're closing in here. Perfect timing. So finally, we're actually getting to the point where you're ramping up for actually doing the planting. And these are just a couple of bullet points of things to think about. Some you may already know, some not, and some may be more useful than others. But again, for timing, best success for potted plants, really have the best success planting as late as I can in the fall after senescence, after they drop their leaves and they're all dormant and they're going to be set ready to spring, and as soon as you can in the spring. Sometimes by the time you can get out and plant, it's already after they would have started growing in the spring, if they were already out there. So you've already lost a couple of weeks. So I really like putting potted plants in the fall. And for cuttings, I put those in as early in the spring as possible. One, to give them as much time to grow as possible, but two, really found that the longer that they've been stored in storage, their viability drops right off. During COVID, when we had harvested a bunch of sticks, and then I didn't have my volunteer crews because of COVID, and I kept waiting for COVID to end, and I didn't, and so I couldn't get my plants in. I waited. By the time I just gave up and I just planted them myself, they were already slimy. And I think their xylem and phloem gets really goopy, and you're basically, it's just dead man walking. They're not going to do anything. So really maximum time in a cooler for storage is kind of that 2-month window. The other thing is, when you're thinking about soaking sticks, go back and forth on this. Both Reese and I have opinions on this, but with cottonwoods, I really only soak them for a couple of days beforehand. And especially if you're planting with a pike and you're then shoving them in a hole, their bark can get really loose over time if they're soaked too long, and kind of can slough off or bust off. And then for willows, I gotta say, just for you can soak them longer, but I've had great success as long as they've been soaked for 3 or 4 days. Other people say to soak them for a week, but the longer that they're out there, most of the time I'm soaking them in a creek with flows and beavers looking at them anxiously. It's just, there's so many things that can go wrong. I want to get them in the ground and protect it as fast as possible. So I don't extend that out. We asked about densities. Really, I encourage high densities just because it helps shade out that phalaris. If you're planting sticks, sometimes you can make up for areas where there isn't a whole bunch of acreage to plant by getting a lot of stem numbers in a dense area rather than a lot of stem areas spread out over a larger acreage. But those high densities also, you may have noticed those fences that I'll talk about here in a second. They're not tall fences. Deer can easily jump over them. But if you've planted really densely after that first year and you're getting some good growth, there's really very little attraction for a deer to jump over the fence into this thicket, because there's no really close place to land. Also, when you remove those fences and it's really dense, those plants kind of protect each other. So beaver aren't the only browsers out there. There's deer, there's elk, there's all these things that want to eat these trees because they're starving too. And by having a dense mess, they're not going to be able to stick their face into there really well. So it's kind of like living caging. Another thing, so Reese was asking about this earlier, or touching on this earlier, but when I am planting potted plants, so those 14-inch potted plants, and basically anywhere where there's thick grass or reed canary grass, you're planting right in that same root mass zone. And so there really is horrible competition from those plants. And you can just imagine, after you've dug your hole, those roots from the phalaris kind of growing in to strangle your plant and kill it off. And so what we started doing was, when we would plan out an area and get ready for planting on the morning of the planting day, we would weed whack all the reed canary grass or whatever the grass it was there down and rake it up out of the way. And that accomplishes a bunch of things. One, it shows a really nice zone. Okay, plant in this weed whack area. So that's nice for kind of volunteer or labor management. It allows you to actually see the ground and get down to the ground. Sometimes it's, that's a lot of phalaris to get through. That'll be covering an area. So it makes for easier work. But also, if you're digging with a shovel, cutting through that grass, if you have a grass mat, it actually stops you. It's hard to dig through, and just because the grass is so strong. And so getting rid of that makes the digging a lot easier. So we weed whack that area, and then we dig our holes and plant, and we will chuck the root wads of it. Sometimes it's just this whole cork of phalaris root mass that we chuck that outside the fence, and you can actually use it for something I'll describe with the fences later. But you chuck that outside and you backfill with your dirt, and then we spread down just clean cardboard, overlapping, no gaps. So like this, not butt to butt, and we cover it with about 2 inches of dirt. And if you've weed whacked it, it gives a good tight seal and it keeps the light out, and the dirt holds it down even when it's flooding. So we've had, foot and a half of water moving slowly through these exclosures, and the dirt doesn't get washed away. It just kind of stays there. And it is remarkable on how much of a difference that makes. So here's a little graph that shows for willow and cottonwood. Blue bars are with cardboard and the orangish reddish ones are without cardboard. And basically the second year after planting, I went around and I measured how many trees there were that grew above my solar plexus. And it was orders of magnitude higher in the areas where I had cardboard. And what was really interesting to see is when I broke that down, the plants that were growing on the edge of the cardboarded area did not as well as the ones in the center of the cardboarded area. So there's kind of an area effect. The bigger the zone was that was covered with cardboard, the better the trees did. I think what's going on there, based on some other things that we did, is that it not only does it prevent the competition, but I think it actually kind of holds that soil moisture in that's coming up from the bottom, and makes it available longer for the plants. And then you're not getting the reed canary grass or whatever sucking all that moisture out as well. When we did cardboarding in areas that were drier and required rainfall to irrigate them, then it actually hurt. There are fewer plants that survived with the cardboard. So we don't do just little collars. We do the whole carpet of the whole exclosure, and overlapping, and it really has to be held down flat and tight. And I can't recommend that enough. I tried it with cuttings, what was that, just last year on a couple of exclosures, because I'm like, oh, it works great. I'll try it on cuttings too, but I think it didn't really seem to make that big a difference. And I think it's because the cuttings just don't care. They're down into the water already anyways. They're not really in that zone of competition. And cardboarding does increase the labor time by about 20%. It takes a ton of dirt and a lot of time just to pour that out and get it spread around. But if you're looking at 400% more plants that are growing above here, and I was getting choke cherries that were fruiting, you know, that first year, just remarkable results. It's that extra 20% is really worth it, especially if you're really limited by how many places you can plant. So the other thing, and I recommend this to basically anybody doing any sort of logistical project, that I really recommend is a whole mental walkthrough, constantly, repeatedly through the process. Just sitting in a quiet room where no one's going to make fun of you kind of staring at the wall, but have a piece of paper for making notes and picture the whole process from start to finish of your implementation day of like, all right, well, this is where we'll, you know, I'll bring the willows down and soak them a couple of days before. Oh, really? Well, where are you going to put them? Oh, yeah. Okay. I need to go find my soaking spot. And you know, how are you going to keep them there? How are you going to keep the beavers away? Oh, yeah. I need to make sure I have material for that to picture it through. So you'll want to think about each thing, doing it consciously yourself. What tools are going to be utilized, how things are going to be moved through, what kind of bottlenecks you're going to find, you know, well, I'll auger holes and my volunteers will follow behind me and plant. Well, I think they can plant faster than I can auger holes. So I better kind of plan ahead and get a couple of holes done before they start planting. Thinking of time and motions of things like that. You're going to have dirt to backfill some of these holes. Where's that going to come from? How are you going to get it? Is it just handy nearby? Can volunteers get it? It's really silly to build your fence before you are moving dirt around, and then people are having to hand buckets over a fence all day long to backfill things up. So think about the timing of how your different order of operations come together and how you can avoid some of those bottlenecks or get people looking at you funny for not really thinking about things. When I'm soaking plants, it's actually every time it's a really big challenge. So in this picture here where I'm soaking plants, you know, they're all in these black bags, and keep talking with different people about what can we do besides black bags that get really hot and clammy in there. And if they not really in the water, they're going to just cook and make all sorts of moldy stuff on the sticks. So that's not ideal right off the bat, but I haven't found a real good alternative for that for storage and transportation yet. But you'll see that I have them in a caged area halfway in the creek. And so I have to have them fenced off for two reasons. One, because beavers kept coming through and they would nibble at the end of sticks that even would poke out through the fence. And two, just over the course of the day, because of evapotranspiration of trees or snowmelt or whatever, your creek is going up and down and up and down. And so things can wash away super easily. And you don't want to lose thousands of trees as they just get washed away. But as you're constructing this, it looks like these bags are up on land, but they're really all in the water. Most part of each bag is in the water. And in this case, it narrowed the channel so much that it really increased the stream power, and my bags would press against the fence really, really hard. So I had to have diagonal bracing of truck straps to other posts and things like that. So don't underestimate what can go wrong dramatically with your soaking. If you're doing things on a on a smaller scale, you know, you can use buckets or something like that, but you want to get the whole stick nice and wet to wake it up and to you know, just start it off with everything it possibly can ahead of time. The other thing with those black bags or working in general in Eastern Oregon, it's like, oh, it's freezing at night and then it's, you know, 80 during the day in April for whatever reason, and your sticks can just get super cooked and dried out. So you really want to think about the time and motion of bringing sticks out, keeping them shaded for as long as you can while they're waiting to be planted. If there's intermediate moments where people can, you know, as they're moving around, they can have them in buckets of water, you'll see there. But you don't want to undo all that good soaking by drying them out and cooking them just as they're waiting to get planted. And yeah, any thoughts on that, Reese? Anything to add? No? I really find that the whole mental walkthrough thing really valuable. I constantly am avoiding some really easy missteps by going that way. So when you're doing your clustered planting, I touched on this earlier, but you can kind of see these sticks are kind of in a row. You want to make sure that however they're there, that you hold them in a certain way that you can make sure that there's nice dirt touching them all the way around. That's going to keep them moist, and that's going to cue their root growth as they grow. Another thing, so this is a collar here. Again, more effective the bigger the area that you can cover with that cardboard, because as soon as if you're just doing a collar, some of that's going to peel up and you're just getting less and less coverage, and then the grass is just going to lift it right up. So you kind of got to go all the way. Now here's a nice exclosure. I'm guessing that nice diagonal point, Reese, is pointing upstream on this one. We'll go with that because that's what you would want to do, is have that diagonal pointing upstream. Reese was talking about having the entrance downstream on the stream side. I like to have it downstream.
No, on the inside.
On the inside? Oh, on the non-stream side.
On the non-stream side.
Perfect. Yeah. Yes, because then you can get into it without getting your feet wet. But also if that seam where your fence is coming together, you have to keep it closed enough that you know, a deer isn't just going to bash it in or something like that. But a lot of times you think of stuff bashing into the upstream end of these exclosures. But a lot of times you'll get water coming through and they'll pick up stuff in your exclosure, and then it'll back up against the back of the exclosure, and then it just bows and bows and bows. And if you have if you're going to lose your fence anyways, if your gate is just kind of loosely closed and it can pop open if it's really getting pressured, it can save your whole exclosure, and that's easier to just run out and fix than the other things of weaning them up and cleaning them off and stuff. But I really have stuck with and haven't yet found anything that I like better than this 60-inch tall welded wire that's got 2x4 inch squares or rectangles on it. And it really does balance effectiveness with cost, and it's really lightweight, so it's easy to use. A lot of my volunteers are just retired folks, and so they're hauling this stuff around and holding it up. It bends easy, it cuts easy. If you're using like no climb wire for orchard or horse fences or something like that, that can be really hard to cut. It's really heavy, it's really expensive. This seems to work really well. Some of the things that are kind of a bummer about it are that the welds that hold it together aren't really strong. And so you'll see this later when I'm wiring it to the T-post itself. I go diagonally around to hold those welds together rather than putting in a situation where it's pulling the welds apart. That'll be more evident in a later picture. The other thing that we do, and you can kind of see it in this picture, there'll be a better picture later. Oh, there, is that at the bottom of the fence, you know, beavers can burrow. And I always have people asking, do I bury my fence? And I'm not going to out bury what a beaver can burrow. It's just as impossible. And so instead of trying to dig down and build my fence down into the ground, which would be a huge amount of labor anyways, I took a cue from building chicken coop fencing, where you just bend out a little skirt at the bottom of the fence there, and it when a beaver comes up to the fence, it comes up right to where the fence meets the ground and tries to dig down, but there's fence in the way there, and it doesn't think to back up, apparently in most cases, and try to dig farther away if you're not right on the edge of if you're not building your fence too close to the edge of the creek. If you're observing that 2.5 thou wag kind of thing, that helps you build it a little farther away. Otherwise, sometimes your fence ends up hanging over the edge of the cliff, and you wouldn't want that. But what you do is you don't make a hard bend that stays there after you let go. It's just a curve. And what that does is it creates this downward pressure. And so it's like this consistent gasket that follows along the surface of the ground and seals it up. And so if you're digging holes in reed canary grass or sedgy stuff or whatever, you can take those corks of roots and you just drop it outside your fence onto that skirt, and they'll grow in and they'll hold it in place. It provides flood protection from low flows, all sorts of things. It's super useful. And every time I've built the fence correctly in the correct location with this method, the beavers haven't gotten in, and invariably where it's not built this way, they get in underneath. On the picture next to it here, you can see, if you're experienced at building barbed wire fence, this T-post looks like it's put in backwards to you, but this is intentional. And when you put in your T-post, since that skirt creates an upward pressure on your fence, it kind of pulls away from the fence post. And so if you have your nubbins on away from the fence, when you tie a wire around it, just a twisty tire wire, I'll use electric fencing wire for this a lot of time because it's soft and easy to use. When you tie it around, when the fence pulls away, that tie wire gets stuck on that little nubbin and keeps the fence from rising up. If you had it the other way, you'd have to, for sure, 100% of the time, have your twisty tie press the fence material itself against those nubbins, and it wouldn't go up. So there's specific ways to do basically everything.
Can I add on that, Jefferson?
Yeah.
I think that is really key, because after you've gone through all of this, you don't want the beavers finding their way through your fencing. And for me, I guess this is when I'm at the end of the day looking at the work that, whether it's paid crews or volunteer crews, where are my failure points on all of this? And it's always in the fencing, and this is worth the time to go on, because if they just get in one place, you just lost all your work. So this is a really important piece to go through and just do quality control. And then this also, this is why when I'm citing where I want to do planting, it's not only informed by the water and the soil, but also where am I going to have even ground? Because, and I think you sort of alluded to it, but it's really important. If you have a lot of uneven ground, then this is almost impossible to get a nice tight seal, if you will. You invariably end up with holes and stuff that you've got to put T-posts into an angle or whatever to keep things flush with the ground so the beavers can't get under. So yeah, always try to find even ground. And then the last thing I was going to say is just like sowing, like a shirt or something like that, where you have a turn on the corners, we usually will do a cut that allows room for that fence to be able to flex out. Because when you've got it on a corner, it's going to take more space. And I'm sure there's a geometric name for that. But yeah, we cut it on the corners to help it flush, go all the way around.
Yeah,
So I just want to add,
you can get angry at it too and just kind of scoosh it a little bit too. It just as the mood strikes you. Yeah, and I would say that idea about the evenness of the ground is not so much topography, but things like little ditches or holes or things like that. If it's gently sloping like this, you're all good. It'll be perfectly fine. But like if you're getting old little canals, and then it boggles my mind when I see people making fences across flowing streams, and that actually happens in the real world, and I would not recommend that. There we go. And then, so yes, you did all this great planting, but really the metric of success is the beavers moving in, and it's not done once you put the last plant in. The work's done when the beavers move in, and until that time, you got to keep your plants alive. You got to maintain your BDAs so they're irrigating them until you get real nice deep roots on your plantings. You got to double check your fences to make sure that they're keeping the beavers out until they're all the way ready. You want to be like Marley there, taking data on survival and what worked and what didn't work, because if you're planting multiple years, you are going to be the best teacher of yourself and your experience to teach the next iteration of your project of what to do and what not to do. So take that, even if it's general eyeballing, like, only 50 of these survived, then 50% of these survived. That's better than nothing else at all. And pictures are fabulous, fabulous too. So we say fail forward. Use those mistakes as a way to learn what not to do next time. And don't be intimidated by all the published successes of what people have had. Nobody really publishes their failures. So I always talk about, it's kind of like the Instagram of the scientific world. Everyone's gorgeous and has six-pack abs, but that's not really the truth. They just don't show you their vacation photos where they're at the all-you-can-eat buffet. So the other thing is eventually you have to remove those fences, and what you want is your vegetation to be established enough that it can survive beaver browse, but also be big enough that it's valuable as beaver browse. So you want to gain interest kind of on your initial deposit there. So here's plantings that are just in their first year of growth, and ones behind them that are 4 years in. And those are very different scenarios as terms of their survivability of browse and what they can offer a beaver. So what happens is, after you've planted a whole reach with plants and they're all fenced off, you have to wait until your youngest plant is about 5 years old before you can take off any fences. If you just took off fences from exclosures as each exclosure got to be 5 years old, that's like an afternoon snack for beaver, and they've just mowed it all down, and then they're just going to stand there waiting by the next exclosure for you to remove that one. And so it's kind of absurd. You want to swamp them with food so they can't possibly eat it all. If they're going to harvest more than that 30 to 50% of a clone, they can kill it off, or damage it so much that it's not going to be able to regrow quickly and provide that constant food source. So last thing here is, when will the beavers arrive? Well, after you remove your fences, hopefully you're going to have a good idea of what beavers are in the area already, because you've been out there on the ground looking at all this other stuff and keeping an eye on beaver sign and such over the years until your plants are ready to be unleashed. And so it's really kind of a situation of island biogeography, where the bigger and closer the population of source beavers are, and the fewer obstacles they have to overcome to get to you, the sooner they'll be there. But really, to be honest, you know, people always ask, well, should I bring beavers in? And I haven't had a single experience where there's been any need at all to bring beavers in. There are beavers anxiously waiting at the door for habitat to open up, and they can travel great distances very, very quickly. And so the real trick is to create the habitat that's going to make them want to move in and to be able to survive and thrive at that location. So yeah, there's just beavers waiting to target your beaver hood that you've created, and they're exploring around all the time, waiting for it to be opened up. Now I do have it's 1:25, and if there are, this is kind of the end. I have some of those timelines I can talk through after this, and I have some projects that can kind of look at for specific examples of some of the people in the workshop specifically. But what I really want to do, let me just go quick to this first, is that these are the kind of things that you said that you were hopefully going to learn during this workshop. And I want you to look through this list real quickly and just kind of assess if you got what you're hoping out of for each one of these categories. I guess identifying different willow species with more confidence. That was the first day. Yeah. But other than that, no pressure. The rest are on me. Think about that, and think about any gaps we might have there. And I'll give you a couple of minutes.
You want folks to put that in chat, Jefferson?
Yeah,
or
they can put it in chat.
Call out anything that's missing.
And in the meantime, let me just go back to this. So this is kind of how my brain works when I'm thinking about planning out a project like this. And I don't know about you all, but I never just have one project going on at a time. I'm always trying to think of what the next projects are. And so these are all overlapping. So this isn't the only thing I'm doing during any given season. There's different levels of projects dovetailing in with each other, but seasonally, you know, that first year, if you're thinking you're getting out to look at a creek finally for the first time in spring, you're looking at those water levels, trying to understand those water levels for where you're going to be able to put your fences. How high does it go? How low might it go? How powerful it is. You know, you can begin installing your trail cameras to look at water flows, because so many places we all work don't have gauges, of course, but you can start getting an idea then and basically building your own hydrograph for the creek yourself with very low cost. You want to get out once the plants are leafed out, so you can start identifying what is out there already, or areas where you might gather sticks. The late summer, when it's dry and hot, that's when you're doing all your diggability and soil moisture testing. You can really capitalize at that time to think about your harvest sites for willow if you're not getting it from a nursery. Continuing to look, like I said, you want to go out there multiple times to look to see what's popping up. Maybe it got eaten the last time you're out there and it's recovered this time, or vice versa, in terms of existing vegetation, and always, every time you're out looking at that beaver activity to understand what they're eating, what they're doing, what their occupancy is, or how often they're moving through, that's going to give you a real clue as to how quickly they're going to move in afterwards. Fall, things can get busy. If you don't have to build BDAs, you might actually be able to do some planting in the fall, and that's really exciting. That's great. If you have to build BDAs, it's really hard to imagine, for myself at least, the ability to do the soil moisture test and figure out where I need to get BDAs, get permitting done, and then turn around and get implementation done before my in-stream work window ends, in time to then also understand how effective my BDAs were to then also plant in the fall. And so I think Reese was speaking to this, that trying to speed that process up made it complicated for citing things. But that's also, if you are doing BDA stuff, as soon as you possibly can, start contacting your permitting folks. And so they love it when people talk to them before they're wondering where their permit is, and are all cheery, and you can figure out what it is you need to do and get a realistic expectations on that. And then in the winter, that's when you can have your downtime to do your BDA permitting. Wilco often has sales on this kind of fencing in February, and it's a great way to buy it and store it for when you need it. That's when you're going to be harvesting your cuttings. Also looking at beaver activity again, because that's going to be a pinch point for beavers, because they're not going to have the forbs and stuff. And start your mental walkthroughs of what your BDA installation is going to be like. If you didn't do BDAs and you're going to get to do some spring planting with your sticks, what's that all going to look like? So you have plenty of time to address any issues. Year 2, so I have sleep, creep, and leap after the typical response of restoration. And year 2, I usually think of when I'm actually finally getting to, really do some stuff. And that's where you're reevaluating how your BDAs did, if you did BDAs. If you didn't need BDAs, you get to plant that spring and that fall, and you really get to go gangbusters on things. Once, if you do have BDAs, then you'll have a final kind of reconnoitering of where your soil moisture areas are, how much acreage you have available, at what depth, and your diggability and all of that. Then you can finally order your potted plants or think about your stick numbers for areas supported by BDAs, and you go through that process. And in a situation where I've got BDAs that are supporting most of my plantings, which is, to be honest, most of the cases, it's year 3 where I'm going gangbusters, and that's where I'm going to be planting thousands and thousands of trees, as much as I can get supplied, frankly. And then after that, it's continuing on. I don't have this in tables, but then it's each spring you'll want to go out and you'll double check your fences and your BDAs to make sure that they're working, and then check on monitoring your survival and all of that, until you open up the fences. And yeah, and this is just a quick slide of, if you remember nothing else, please remember you have to plant plants where there's water year round. That we're talking about planting a lot of plants, not just a little beauty strip along the creek where it's easy, or just enough to fight erosion. We're talking about tons of plants to feed beavers. Picture that cone, that funnel that Reese had, and that oh boy, misspelled exclosures there. You want to have really effective exclosures, and because you want to protect your investment, all that work that you put into it. So, and this fourth bullet point is intentionally set off a little bit on its own, because I really have to emphasize it's too easy to rely on GIS or remote maps or all these other things. There's no substitute for getting out yourself, often on the ground, and looking at these areas. And it may seem like a luxury or something extra, but it is what makes the difference in a project. And thank goodness we work in a field where, well, you just have to go walk along a creek and check things out. Lucky us. And the important things here, just the thoughts about cuttings versus potted plants and diversifying willow species. Those are just additional things that Reese and I keep talking about in terms of diversifying and kind of getting that inherent resilience of our plantings over time. So we're back to the slide. Any thoughts of gaps or new things that you didn't think that you wanted to know that you knew? Or to be honest, actually, I'd love to hear back anything that you might have learned today that might be useful that you hadn't thought of before. Like, was there one thing that made it worth sitting through an entire day of listening to me blab that made it worthwhile? Or I'd love feedback.